Can we get a bio of you, an introduction of you, and that can lead us into the conversation of what you're doing and what we're doing here?
Sure. I am originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I am a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota in Minnesota Twin Cities. This is my 5th academic year, hoping to be done after the 6th. So it's getting there. I do Korean studies, modern Korean literature, mostly of the 60s and 70s. I would say mostly of the 70s, at least for now. I used to be an English teacher here for 2 years. I was in Hongcheon in Gangwon-do for a year, and I taught at 5 different schools.
Wow.
We can talk about that another day.
Is that because you were really good or really bad?
Yeah. No, that was the role.
Okay.
That was, and then actually, I think so many of us maybe complained, if that's the right word, about this is too much. Like, this is spreading us too thin. Yeah. We have no rapport with the students, whatever. And then they reduced it to 4 schools after my year. And everybody that had that position before me all only did 1 year. Mm-hmm. And it's like, maybe we should do something to keep them around longer. Yeah.
When was this?
2016.
2016.
When I first came here. Yeah, so 8 years ago already, almost. And then I did a year in Hagwon in Nowon-gu. Oh. And if you're familiar with Uneng Sagori.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, that's where the Hagwon was. Mm-hmm. And did that for a year. And then couldn't really decide what to do. I knew I didn't want to keep doing the Hagwon thing anymore. It was just too much.
What brought you over to Korea in the first place? Like in 2016, were you a big K-pop fan, or you were just like,
no,
let's go the other side of the world?
I needed a job.
Yeah.
So, which sounds like, kind of a privilegey thing, but that I can just travel and whatever. But I failed two years in a row to get into graduate school. First for an MFA in poetry, and then second for an MA in English literature. I kept applying, and I got rejected. And then I was working at Starbucks as a barista, typical English major stuff. Yeah. And then, I got my TESOL certificate and just thought, why not get something on my CV and boost it a little bit, and then come back and maybe I'll get accepted finally. Then I ended up I worked at an office job for a little bit, didn't like it, and then went to grad school. And Korea was still sort of on my mind, and I wasn't sure exactly what to do with it, but I knew I was very much interested in youth and education and development and something like that. And then over the last 5 years, it's been honed into literature. So, because my background, my undergrad was in literature, so I was like, so maybe I can do something with this. And here we are.
I've asked people that came in like the 1960s and 1970s about their first impressions and what it smelt like and things like this.
Yeah.
What was 2016 Korea when you arrived? Like, I've never asked anybody that. What were your first impressions? It's quite recent, but also very long ago in terms of Korea.
Well, it was interesting because I didn't really get to see. Not that saying that Seoul is all of South Korea, but I didn't get to see.
It is for some people.
Right.
The rest
25 million people live within an hour of here. So, I think 2016, I got off the plane, and then we stayed in a hotel for one night, like near Incheon. And then, we went straight to Gangwon-do. And we met our co-teachers or whatever, and they sort of took us around. And so that was the Korea that I saw first, driving through the mountains in spring where everything is pretty much dead still. And I was, I don't know what to expect. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't speak any Korean, nothing. I think it was another couple weeks until I I got to Seoul and saw what it was like. So Gangwon-do and Hongcheon specifically was just total. I mean, I don't think culture shock is the right enough of a word. It was just, what am I doing? I was like, this is so different. I live in this tiny studio apartment in the middle of a city, in a countryside city, right? Like where nobody speaks English. I mean, if they do, I never knew. Like, and then you just go to these schools, and you're just supposed to teach to children who, at least the children I taught, were quite low in their levels, which is very typical for like countryside. And yeah, it was like, it took about a month or two to figure out like, what am I doing? Did I make the right decision? Well, it's kind of too late. I already signed the contract. I'm here. So what am I going to do? Yeah. But the first impression, I think, was really just, first of all, sensorium overload.
Yeah.
I mean, it smells different. The air is different. It's heavier. It's even in the countryside, you know, it's the food and the air it's
People
tangible.
talk about shower pressures and things like this, and my hair's different, and like, but they even talk about water pressure, air pressure.
The fact that you have a shower room with your washing machine inside of it, that was like, okay, and you got to figure out how to wash your clothes. Also, no dryer. So that to me was like, oh my God, I was spoiled. Like, and now I have to buy a clothes rack and just wait. Yeah. And then my towels turn into like Brillo pads because they're so hard and like feel like steel. Just stuff like that. It was like just so different.
But something got into you. Right? There's something about Korea, because you did that. You did a year in No-won, then you did an MA, you did a master's in Korean studies. Is that right? Now you're doing a PhD, and now you're back here. So there's something about Korea that's gotten into you somewhere.
Yeah, it's like Godfather. Pull me back in.
No. I'm curious what that thing is, though. Because I'm not sure if it's describable. I'm not sure if it's the same for everybody.
Yeah, it's it's definitely not the same for everybody. I've met people who just sort of wound up here. You know, they came after the IMF crisis and then just stayed. Because they saw an opportunity, and then they just kind of, this is where their life fell. And for me, it was, I don't know, it was always intriguing. I was always intrigued by the type of systems of society that work here or don't work for some people. I think one of the biggest things was I just always felt a different type of safer here. And that might be for a million different things. It might be just my anxiety. It might be overblown media coverage about how violent the U.S. is, which is really not, depending on where you are. But it's not like it's a war zone, you know. But it was a different type of thing. It was a different type of a social vibe. I don't know how else to describe it. I've never been in a place where I thought, all right, I can leave my laptop here while I go to the bathroom. Like that, totally new thing. Yeah. And that sounds very, very naive, but that's, you know, you just don't do that in the States. You just, hey, can you watch my laptop while I go to the, you know, it's like, but here it's like, you shouldn't even ask somebody. Right. If you say that, it's kind of strange, right? Right. They wouldn't. Or you go for a smoke, you go whatever, and you come back and it's right there. But that is not to say that people don't steal here. Sure. I've had one of my friends when we were living in Hongcheon had his bike stolen. I was going to say they steal bikes. That's a big thing. Something about Jeonjeong, like that's like the very valuable thing, which is strange because the CCTV is outside. Yeah. And I don't know what the appeal is about. I called this concept in one of my articles Malm spacing, which is a bad word, but it was this behavior that I saw everybody doing. And I would ask, and I was like, you know, people in other parts of the world don't do this. And Korean people would look at me and go, what? And I'd be like, leave their stuff there. And then because you become so used to it that you forget that it's different. Right. And you forget that what's going on. What's your take on this, Yunseo? Like this kind of just leaving your stuff there. Do young people still into that, or is it you getting a bit scared? Or because I mean, society changes very quickly, and sometimes I think that
sometimes we might feel very safe, but sometimes I think young Korean people, sometimes they feel more anxiety than us.
Right.
I don't know. What's your take on safety or maum spacing?
Yeah, I think that mom spacing is a thing in Korea still. And I think that it's because of Korean nunchi thing, I guess. Because like for bicycles, there are like people outside, but they do not really watch you standing right there. They just pass, just walk away. But in cafe, you have like your seat and other people are looking at you. You feel like they are looking at you and you don't feel like to steal in front of people watching you.
Yeah.
So that might be a nunchi thing, I guess.
Do you feel safe here in general?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So it's not like, it's what I like about the nunchi thing. It's not necessarily that Koreans are naturally morally better people or don't steal, but it's like, Jesus, everybody's watching.
Yeah.
Sometimes when my international students go, I feel like everybody's staring at me. And I say to them, you're becoming Korean. Do you know what I mean? Because all Koreans feel like people are staring them all the time. That, well, 남의 시선, like public gaze or something like that is a big thing here, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And there's always different aspects to look at it. You know, how safe you might feel as a woman is probably very different from a male or whatever. Your race, gender, whatever. Yeah. Obviously, but I just think that, at least for me, that was one of the first things that sort of resonated with me as an an American person who arguably never studied anything about Korea until 2016.
Could people in America believe that Korea was safe? Because I'm sure that, I think for many people, Korea is associated with North Korea and missiles and war and just the very name. And this is not to throw shade on those people, but if you haven't been here, if you don't have the geographic knowledge, you might just think, Korea? Wow, missiles.
Right. Or I got the question, which one are you going to?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know how to. Even if you are in the dark about East Asian geopolitical matters, I think that you should still know. But yeah, that was one of the questions I got too. But yeah, otherwise, that was, like I said, that was the biggest thing. I think that really stuck with me. But then to continue with living here and wanting to come back and teaching again, I don't know. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed teaching as a thing, as a potential career. Obviously, the Hagwon thing didn't work out, but that wasn't because of the teaching or because of the students. It was like the structure of the system that I just don't agree with anymore. And once you're in it, you're like, oh, this is how things are going. Like, oh, students really don't eat dinner. Oh, okay, that's why they're eating ramyeon at 11 o'clock at night. It's things like that I was like, I don't think I can.
You didn't like being part of that system
almost. No, right.
Wow.
Right. And I think every Hagwon's different. I've heard nightmare stories, but I've also heard stories that people stuck around for 5-6 years at the same Hagwon. And it it depends on a lot of things, your coworkers and your boss and how much work they give you. Sometimes they're very generous, sometimes they're very demanding. But again, I think the system itself is more demanding on the students than the boss is on the teacher, because you could leave. As a teacher, you can leave, and students, they really can't. They can go to another Hagwon, but they're still in the same sort of system at 10 years old, So, yeah, but I enjoy teaching after all that. Yeah. And then, I think getting into Korean studies, I wanted to know more. I wanted to learn more about this place, about this country, its history, its the peninsula's history. I mean, everything. And everything sort of came together in a literary sense. So,
what did you do in the master? What was the master's? Was there a focus in there, or?
So in this program, you get your master's along the way to your PhD. So I've been in Minnesota since 2019.
Okay.
So, and then you just get your master's along the way, and then you you're accepted as a PhD student, and then you get that along the way. And some people just master out, and then they think, I don't want to do the rest of it,
Right.
and which is totally understandable.
Yeah.
So you do that, and then you just continue if you feel like you can do it. So that was in also Korean literature, or in Asian studies, I think, but a Korean literature focus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're doing Korean literature, and you're doing it specifically, well, round about the Park Chung-hee era. And this is fascinating, because on the way over here, I was like, I didn't live during that time. Like, what am I going to say?
Right.
Like, so the Park Chung-hee era, like 1961 to 1979, something like that. I mean, it's probably the most, I don't know, transformative. You call it one of the most tumultuous industrialization period led by the authoritarian president. Shall we perhaps try to unpack some of that era? Before we look at the literature and the people and the books, maybe tell us about this era, why you've chosen it and how you see it and what it is.
I think in a lot of ways, something happens when you're doing research that things happen serendipitously. You're interested in one thing, and then you read one thing outside of your interest, and you're like, oh my God, I can make these connections. Yeah. And like I said before, I was always interested in youth and development in a very general sense. And so I thought, okay, what can I do something with youth? And then I actually, this is sort of a roundabout story, but I was interested in youth and education, but that seemed to me, I was speaking with one of my advisors, and they said that was more of an anthropological approach rather than what our department does, which is more film and literature and sort of area studies kind of thing. It's just different. And I said, well, I want to stay in this department. And so anyway, once we got in, I took my advisor's modern Korean literature class, and we read Namok, or The Naked Tree, and Park Hwang-sok, and The Dwarf. And I was like, okay, there's something here with the youth in these stories, these young people going through this period and developing alongside the nation that was developing. And it's sort of a Frederick Jameson kind of allegory thing. And I was like, okay, there's something there. And then I just sort of went down the rabbit hole, as you do on Wikipedia, and you just sort of learn and learn and learn and learn. And something about the period just really fascinated me. I was like, how people look at it is so vastly different depending on who you talk to, and how does one deal with the fact that it was an extremely industrialized period where the GDP went up by thousands of whatever, but at the same time you had so much oppression and suppression from the top down. And I was thinking, well, how do people navigate that? And again, my background is literature, so literature is always going to be there. It's always going to have something to say. And I just got intrigued by that. How does literature respond to this? Does it act along those lines? Does it support these ideas of redevelopment or whatever, or does it actively go against it? And you find out that it's both, that things can go both ways at the same time. So yeah, tumultuous is an interesting word. I think I had to choose something that meant up and down. Yeah. Just that it's in a confusing way. Sort of uprooting, but at the same time sustaining an idea of Koreanness. I was just like, what? Looking on the synonyms.
When I asked Yunseo for what this might be in Korean, the word tumultuous, one of the words she gave was shikuron, noisy, which I think is a lovely Korean way of describing it. It's a very noisy period.
Right.
And if you ask people about Korean politics, they're like, shikuron. They'll just say, it's noisy.
Right.
It's like that cacophony of events and people and voices, perspectives.
Would you describe South Korea as noisy now?
It's noisy in a silent way, you know. It's very difficult to.
It's politics is noisy. Media is noisy.
Right.
The subways and the streets. My students will. Sometimes I'm not here, so I love the views of people that are just coming in here and getting those fresh eyes. Helps me defamiliarize. And they'll say, "Professor, the subway's so quiet." The Japanese students will tell me, "The subway's really noisy." They will tell me, because compared to Japan, so is the Korean subway noisy or quiet? Well, it depends where you come from. But the Europeans and North Americans will tell me, the subway's really quiet, Professor. It's freaky. Yeah. Nobody says anything.
Right.
Yeah. So there's the silence of it.
Yeah.
Nobody does small talk on the street.
No.
While you're waiting for a bus in Korea, you don't say, nice weather, isn't it?
Right.
They'll just look at you.
If they even heard you, because they have their earphones in. So.
Yeah.
And they're watching some drama on.
Yeah.
Or, you know. Or they're reading their webtoons.
One headphone. That's something that I've been researching. People just wear one headphone.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. But why? What?
You want to like go with your vibe with the music, but you also have to listen to the announcement of the bus coming. So yeah, you cannot like have like only one. Yeah, you cannot give up.
Yeah. So they've always got to be plugged in. It's interesting.
Yeah.
Right? I've seen people in shops do it and things like that. And so it's like, well, I'll talk to you if you want, but I've also got my music going at the same time.
See, I have such an opinion on that, because I think, as I remember working in the service industry, and people would come in with their earphones in and order and be on the phone at the same time. And I just, that is like tattooed in my brain that I can't understand that if you can't have the best of both worlds.
When I looked at this,
you got to sacrifice something.
I said in one of my pieces about the one earphone thing, because I was this sounds weird, but I was in a Fred Perry shop.
Okay.
Buying some like V-neck jumpers for winter, because I needed some V-necks to wear. And so we went to Fred Perry, and you know, this is not Giordano. You're spending a couple $100 to buy some jumpers that will last. And the guy serving us had one headphone in.
Really?
This is not a convenience store in a subway station, right? This is a whatever level of market you want to call it. But I was like, that's fascinating to me. So I went and explored it. But what I'd say about this, Tanner, is that this is a real big tangent from the Park Chung-hee era. But I struggle to put my elbows on the table when I eat. I was told not to do that. That's really rude. I was told not to put my hands in my pockets when I talk to old people. Right. Okay. And these are ingrained in me. But now people have got their elbows on the table, their hands, so etiquette changes.
Right.
And when I spoke to young people about one headphone, they said to me, well, it means that I'm kind of open to conversation if you want it. It's like not a red light, it's not a green light, but it's an orange light. So it's like, you want to talk, if you're interested, I will. But if not, here we go.
Do you think that's up to the other person? Or it's up to the person with the earphone in?
I think it's up to the person with the earphone. It's up to you to be interesting to them to talk to you. But it's like, I'm not fully tuned out. Right. I'm kind of here. It's like a social agreement or whatever it is. Right. It's a compromise, is the word. Yeah. Obviously, they didn't wear one headphone in the Park Chung-hee era.
No, right.
Let's get back to how do you understand this era? Because none of us lived through that era, but it's not that far. But it feels like a million miles away sometimes, I guess. Tell us about this era a bit more, as you see it.
I see it as very productive. And, to use production in a sort of Marxist sense, and productive in a sort of intellectual sense, however, and it's that's why I think I'm so intrigued by it, is because I don't know how to understand it yet, and I don't know if other people really fully do, even if they lived through it, because it depends on who you talk to, like I said, and it seems like it was productive for most, but also very suppressive or oppressive for others, depending on which side of the fence you were on. And I think that it was beyond the division of North and South Korea. I don't think, from what I can see, such an ideological divide internally is what was happening, especially during the 1970s.
What was the ideological divide?
I think you had communism and anti-communism, and I think you also had sort of, if you want to call it like 도시성, like something like this sort of urban mentality, this sort of developmentalist mentality, and in that you're gonna have people who are left behind and who are almost left behind on purpose because we are a forward-thinking nation now. We need to move on. We need to get over the Korean War and our losses and our whatever. Yeah, you had family members who passed away, but well, it's 1975 now. You know, that was 20 years ago, whatever. And so I think it's such an up and down emotionally, intellectually, economically. I think all of these things were happening at the same time in a relatively short period of time. And so when you look at phrases like miracle on the Han, miracle for who, you know, in a global sense, sure, if we look past all the other small details about it. Yeah, there's a lot of skyscrapers now. But as you said in your previous video, was it worth it? Like, how do we determine that? So that's how I see the period is in just complex and productive and industrialized and big things and, you know, money, but at the same time, just an enormously expanding gap of wealth that occurred during that time, not just in South Korea, but in the world over. But
was it very forward-thinking, do you say? Did it have its eye on the future rather than the past? Excuse me. 'Cause that's how
from the top, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think so very much. Park Chung-hee is quoted in many different speeches about we have to honor this past, but also get over it. It's there. We have a very traditional Korean 민족 society, but look at all the stuff that we could accomplish. Look at what we can do as a people. If we forget the rest of the past, but the general population, the actual 민족, not so much. Very much. In the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of literature involving nostalgia and things like that. So clearly they weren't exactly, seeing eye to eye.
Yeah. This semester, I realized that many South Korean people and Asian people more broadly have no concept of intergenerational trauma. Maybe that's just a remnant, or maybe they just give it different names or different words. But you can see there, maybe in what you're saying about Park Chung-hee, it was just like, no, let's go forward. Yes, there's bad stuff in our past, and Korea had perhaps more bad stuff than many other nations around the world. And maybe it was necessary to kind of forget some of that to go forward in Park Chung-hee's mind.
Right.
Yunseo, the Park Chung-hee era, do you learn about it at school? Does like your grandparents, your parents sit down and tell you like Latin and Malia or something like that? What's your take on that era?
We Korean students learn it in history textbook, but the textbook is pretty neutral about him because I think that he was the kind of president who got very multidimensional evaluation because he made the industrialization to be a thing, and he developed a country, but the method that he used was somehow compulsory. So people who remembers the pain in that era may evaluate him as a bad person, but people who look at the further distance would feel him as a great leader who led the Korea to be like developed country. So the textbook covers like all kinds of his stuffs very neutral way. And I also asked my parents about him because I was being in this podcast, but they didn't quite gave me their opinion because they just wanted my opinion on this one.
Did you come up with an opinion?
I'm not really sure, but do you remember the allegory that I told you in your car? The thing was, if you want your children to go to elite university, then if you support them with money and love and happiness, they would be happy and you would be good parents, but they would be feeling too free to study, right? But if you just deprive them of their phone and like disconnect their internet access, they would possibly study and get a good grade, but they would be soulless robotic genius, I think.
So Park Chung-hee took away people's
Yeah,
TVs
like
as well.
yeah, reading from the novels.
Yeah. Many Koreans say, I didn't have a television growing up and things like that. That was a big thing, taking that away. There's a fabulous, I'll just add this, there's a fabulous photo in the Hungarian ambassador's name it's just escaped me, something like Moses Somoza. That's a really bad pronunciation. But he wrote a history of Korea through both the South and North Korean lens and how they interpret all the different events. Fascinating book, very difficult to get hold of. But in the back, there's a photo of Park Chung-hee sat in the White House with JFK, and he's sat there with his sunglasses on, smoking a cigarette. And I'm just looking at this man going, wow. Just imagine doing that today. Imagine rocking up in the White House with your shades on, smoking a cigarette, talking to the US president. I know it's a different time, but it just blew me away how much of a different time that was.
Right.
That you could do that. You could sit opposite the president in the White House, smoking a cigarette with your sunglasses on, just sat back.
Right.
You can almost see him, kind of. He's a very small man.
Yeah.
I was just like, that's some confidence, man. That's a military man. Yeah.
Very much a military man, very much poised in his confidence. Especially those sunglasses, what are they, aviators?
Yeah.
That's like such his iconic look.
Yeah.
And the watch, I think, that he gave to Park Chung-hee, which was like an uproar thing about her wearing that.
Speak about the watch.
There in one of the famous presidential pictures of Park Chung-hee, he's wearing a gold watch, and I think they're in, I want to say 2016 or something like that, when Park Chung-hee was still president. Something like she wore the watch to a speech or something, and there was like this uproar about like this memory of this man. Obviously, that's her father, but. I might be getting something wrong, but I remember something about the watch and her wearing it and it being like, why are you wearing that? Because it's such, I think almost like cigarettes, like these pictures, like you capture the man or the individual, and that is one of those things that I will remember. Is like either him with that watch, him smoking, or him pointing at something. Those are those are the three things. But yeah, very, very. I think he, to his credit, I think was very a confident man, and these pictures I think definitely show it. But if you want to talk about the man Park Chung-hee, if we can get into that now or later, but there are some things that I have read about him that are quite interesting too.
What's interesting?
According to one of his biographers, who wrote, I think, the most famous biography of Park Chung-hee, From Poverty to Power, Lee Jung-sik.
Okay.
And the title or the cover page has one of his pointing pictures, but he talked about his reverence for Napoleon. And because of Napoleon I think this is actually historically inaccurate, but like was always seen as a short individual.
That's how he was portrayed by British propaganda,
right.
I think.
And so there's like this, it's almost, myth at this point that Park Chung-hee looked up to, because Park Chung-hee was a very relatively short man, especially for being a president. And he looked up to Napoleon because of the short stature, but look at all he did, so that's sort of like, it's almost like anecdotal, or sort of, I don't know if it's actually true, but that's in that particular book's.
You were talking about some of the myths as well, like not the castor oil, the
soy sauce.
Yeah, what's the soy sauce myth?
As I hear, there was a myth that if a pregnant woman drinks a bottle of soy sauce, like whole thing, she would lose her baby in her belly. So like his mother didn't want him to born. So she tried rolling down the hills or something like that and drank the whole bottle of the soy sauce. But
I've heard that too.
Yeah. But he born anyway.
his destiny.
Yeah.
But it's amazing that, you know, everybody's heard these stories.
Yeah, I know. It always it gains a mythical quality to it,
Yeah.
right? Like any other leader or whatever. Do you know that he went through such trials and tribulations as a child, and like this Herculaic sort of, you know, look at all the great things he did then.
It's become even more true because I was fascinated that Yunseo knows these stories
Yeah,
as well. I was like,
right.
wow, even your generation.
Right.
It's like snowballing and becoming hyper real.
Right. And so, yeah, that's why when you said, I was intrigued by the word neutral that you used in you know, how would you define neutral? Park Chung-hee did such and such, and like it's sort of stated in a fact way, and like what do you mean by neutral? Like just sort of he did things and that's it?
They just list up the things that he did, and
Yeah.
they do not say he did good thing or bad thing. They
Right.
do not say those.
Does it talk about the anti-communist oppression
Um,
and his KCIA dealings? I'm wondering.
as I remember, the textbooks didn't really dig into like his earlier biographies. I
Okay.
think, yeah, like maybe after him being a president thing is the main thing in textbook because they focuses on the like presidential periods.
Right. Yeah.
Do the textbooks say much? Because there's a big controversy over textbooks in Korea. Who
Yeah.
gets to
Yes.
control? Who gets to write the
Yeah.
past? Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you ever study much when you study that area about communism, like 공산주의 or anti-communism of that time? Is that ever mentioned in the textbooks when you do 수능 and 역사?
As I remember, it was pretty brief.
Yeah.
Yeah, not so deep.
Yeah. I remember even at graduate school, one of my professors, we were doing like international political economy. He got to the chapter on communism. He went, "We're skipping that." And he was just like, "Just no, we do not talk about this." And I think, you know, there's certain elements that's a very kind of strong word or idea, the idea of communism, and we have, you know, socialist parties in Europe and things
Right.
like that. We're not too scared of the word.
Right.
But over here, I think there's a still great big sensitivity to it.
Right. Depending on the time and the era and, you know, the context and
Yeah.
who's leading the government at that period of time.
Yeah.
Yeah, the anti-communism thing is always very interesting because Park Chung-hee was a member of the Workers' Party in the late 40s.
Yeah.
So he was arguably a communist, or at least communist-leaning.
So
What
those
do you have to say
5-year
about that?
Those 5-year plans,
Yeah.
you know, state-centered economic growth.
Yeah.
You know, I sometimes wonder, what is that? You mentioned earlier this idea of the miracle on the Han River, and sometimes I'm not sure where that term first came from. Actually, that'd be an interesting thing to find out. Did it come from the West? Did it come from America? Did it come from Korea? Because sometimes it's used to hide the fact that so many, you know, factory girls were just sent in from the countryside, right, from the jibangs into. It wasn't a miracle. This was blood, sweat, and tears, and lives, and Jeon Tae-il, and the sacrifice, and at the same time, the miracle on the Han River. This kind of like comes down from the skies, but it wasn't democracy that made Korea rich.
Right.
Korea got rich and then it became a democracy. It's like, so there's this American dream that's projected. If you become a democracy, you'll become rich. But it's like,
Yeah.
Here they became rich by really controlling the economy, I think.
It was always the economy first and democracy second.
Yeah.
If at that. And then human rights maybe sixth.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm not exactly sure, and I should know that, where the term miracle on the Han came from.
Go on.
I don't believe it came from internal. I don't think it came from South Korea. I feel like it definitely came from either the U.S. or one of its allies, but I'm quite sure it would be the U.S.
A Washington think tank.
Yeah. Because this is how we sell it, right?
Yeah.
We have a quick slogan, and now we can invest in South Korean export, import, whatever. Yeah. So I'm fairly certain about that. But
shall we perhaps move on to some
Sure.
of the literature
Sure.
of this time? So how you get into that, and you chose these various books. Maybe Korean literature more broadly. Before we look at the Korean literature of that era, or you can start there if you want. But I think K-pop is well known, K-dramas, K-movies, Korean literature. Is there such thing as Korean literature? Is Korean literature different? I mean, sometimes it feels like it stands in the shadow of Japanese literature with more well-known figures, Natsumi Soseki, Haruki Murakami, those kind of things. Korean literature, Tanner?
Sure. I think Korean literature, like every literature from at least East Asia, has very, very deep roots. From the very little knowledge I have about pre-modern literature, it was very much a Yangban thing in the Joseon era, but it was written in Hanja. I mean, this was a thing that wasn't very accessible for a very, very long time, arguably until the 20th century. Even then, but so they had a lot of formal techniques, a lot of poetry. You could argue the Chunghyang, that sort of thing was like literature. Even pansori, I would could also consider that a type of literature. And then you had the what is it, 1894? I think the Kubo. The
Gabo reforms.
Gabo, the reforms. Yeah, thank you. Where you had the introduction from Japan via the West about these different techniques, different types of literature that were influenced mostly from France and Germany, and then you have this sort of train of thought, and then, like with everything around the turn of the 20th century, you had this sort of modern thing, this modern literature that comes in and, we don't have to write in these strict forms for our poetry. We can experiment a little bit. We can have vers libre, like the free verse poetry, whatever, and things like that. And so around that turn of the century, you had a lot of experimentation, as you did in Europe. I mean, with the modernists in the early 20th century. It was more or less the same thing here. It just took a little bit longer to get here. But you did have a lot of experimentation, especially under colonialism. A very, very interesting relationship between adapting these forms that they learned, a lot of the sort of literati people like Lee Kwang-soo, who studied in Japan and then came back and brought these forms that he had learned, and then sort of, now they proliferate and they spread. So how do we adapt these in a Korean way? How do we write our own history, write our own narratives, but in these sort of borrowed forms? And I'm very cautious to use it like that because forms are forms. I don't know if they belong to anybody. But yeah, and then you had the 20s and the 30s, and you had the KAPF, the Korea Artist Proletariat Federation, from the late 20s to the 30s, who were very, very, what's the word? Proletariat leaning, very influenced by Marxism and things like that. And then it was, no surprise, disbanded because under colonial censorship.
I know nothing about that group or the writing or something. I mean, during that time, I think of, was it Isang and things like this?
Yeah.
Tell me about the proletariat writers.
It was very, very focused on the like I said, influenced by Marxist thought.
Do Marxists make good poetry?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't. Yeah, right. It wasn't. Yeah, it was. I mean, it was focused on the laborer, the proletariat, and the landowners. A very divisive and distinct us and them kind of thing. And it did get them somewhere, I think. It got them to experiment with different forms and different sort of allegorical type works. But in my opinion, I think it only got them so far. And then because it's, I mean, how much can you write about us and them? It becomes a very prescriptive or very stereotypical almost type of style. I mean, some people might disagree, but then you had like the 30s and Isang and things like that, who got much more focused on the individual. And with the 30s, you had this sort of more modernization. You had like the department stores, and you had like this developed colonial city that, you know, now we have trains and buses and we have to get around and we have these office jobs and et cetera, et cetera. And yet we're still subjects to the colonial rule. So how do we navigate being an individual under this system, but also part of this sort of world system now that we're involved in, apparently. Yeah, and then it's kind of sort of getting there eventually. And then you have, so that was like sort of the modernism. And then I would say 50s, 60s, you had a turn to realist works, a much more societal focused, you know, social psychology kind of deal, where so much was happening. Obviously the war, you know, a civil war. How do we deal with our brothers and sisters and families right over there on the other side, and now we can't see them for the rest of our lives? So like, how do you deal with that in a very realist sense? That's not using naturalist approaches, I want to describe this in the most visceral, the most emotional, realistic way I can. And I think in the 50s going into the 60s, you had that. You had this sort of much more bleak outlook because the war had just destroyed everything that we had. And so how do we rebuild? Well, here's Park Chung-hee, and he wants to rebuild everything. Oh, but he's not that great of a, you know, so it's, and that's where my interest comes in, I think.
So the writing of the time is like the realist. So as you see it, they go through the pre-modern, which is the hanja and the traditional forms. The modernist writing is during the colonial period, and that's kind of more experimental. And then as the Republic of Korea, South Korea, gets established and it's trying to go through these things, it's more realist writing.
I would say, yeah.
This might be a difficult question, but all countries' literature, they'll be sort of rebelling or reacting to their literature of the past. So although sort of all different countries might be writing modern literature, their roots will be different. Do you know anything about what the different, like the hanja, the literature of the Joseon dynasty? You mentioned like traditional forms and things like this. Can you say anything about that? What people were rejecting? Because I know Dostoevsky and I know Chaucer and I know Tolstoy. If somebody asked me to name a Joseon dynasty writer, I might go.
I think I would struggle to.
Any writers from the Joseon dynasty?
Joseon dynasty?
Yeah.
조선 시대 그 뭐지 작가이나 아니면
maybe Hogyun or someone like that.
Okay.
Yeah, it feels like a KSAT now.
Yeah. Don't worry, we're all failing it together.
And I'm sure there are plenty of scholars who would say, "Oh, don't you think of this guy or that?" You know, whatever.
They're screaming at us right now.
Yeah. But yeah, that's a good question. If they were, I know for sure in the 20th century, and particularly the period that I focus on, there was a concern about how do we define national literature. Now that we are a nation, now that we have this thing of a country that, you know, we are just sort of left with, okay, how do we write it in our way? How do we decide that? And I think that was, I would argue it's still very much going on in a sense. Very much like, how do you define K-pop? What is the K? There's a lot of research going on about that too. So I would, in reaction to, so I'll say two things. One thing is the generation of writers that I focus on is the Hangul generation, Hangul seide, who chose, or they were the first generation of writers who did not grow up having to learn Japanese. And so that was very significant. So like Chosei-hee, Hangul generation, didn't have to learn Japanese. and so didn't have to write in it. Didn't want anything to do with it. But with the hanja thing, a lot of the work I read still has hanja in it. Maybe not the updated Korean versions, but the original definitely has a lot. And I think maybe Yunseo, you can attest to this. Young people don't learn hanja as much, if at all.
Don't.
Yeah. So that shows you.
Please don't tell my kids this if they do their Gubon.
Right.
But go on.
No, I sort of kick myself. I would love to dedicate, I should say, more time to learning hanja, because it's very integral to what I have to read, but I learn it as I go, kind of thing.
Were they still, just while you're talking about the form, so when they were writing, this was the Hangul Shide, Sede, which, interesting, I've not heard that before. Were they still writing top to bottom, back to front at that time? Because you say there's handa in there, so that's the form switched, because people still read some manhwa.
Right.
I think some of the comics and some of the books, this is a very Western style, top to bottom, left to right, whereas previously it was completely flipped, wasn't it?
That's a good question, and I don't have a particular. Maybe Yunseo, I don't know the specific. I think it was a very messy turn.
Yeah.
Some of the archival works I've looked at were from the 60s or 70s were top to bottom, right to left, and then I would start trying to read it left to right, and I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. Oh, I got to read it backwards.
Yeah.
Or backwards. I don't know about the transition. I think it was very messy. I think it was. I don't think it was ever decided. It was just sort of one day, this is how this individual is going to write, and then I think the readership was just sort of left to, like, oh, this person's writing like this. Now I have to read it like that. I don't know. Do you know?
No.
When the transition happened? Yeah. I don't know if there's an exact answer for that.
There's another one that we need to go and Google later.
Yeah.
We need a little Google person sitting here. It happened in 1975 thanks to a dictator.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, like, when you look at, say, pictures from, the colonial period, you can kind of guess, like, if there's a sign for a store or something, you could kind of, more or less, it's going to be right to left, I'd say, in most of them. But, like signs, I think in the pictures that I've seen of Park Chung-hee Era, mostly left to right, but it's anybody's.
There was definitely
guess.
a lot more handa.
Yeah.
That you don't just see as much. We talked about this on the last podcast, but just in the newspapers, the books, the signs, the streets, there was just, you could see that was changing. That was taking place. You mentioned, should we, maybe some of the writers, or some of the literature itself. Maybe we should open up some of these, because I'm curious, because I didn't study Sunung, so I don't. Tell us about some of these. Maybe the Dwarf.
Okay. Sure. The Dwarf. That was the first novel I think that really, really intrigued me about what is happening in this period. And it actually happened. This was written in 1978 and 79, so right at the very end. It's a novel of. It's a very, very broken novel, and it's. And I'm forgetting the Korean word for it right now, and I should know this. But like, it's basically a stitched together novel, 난장이가 something. That's not right, but it's like, it's stitched together these stories that could be read individually, but they are made up together in a specific way to make a novel. And then if you read them like that, it does make sense. Okay. But they were published individually.
In a newspaper, in a journal, or something.
In a newspaper. And I am forgetting what journal it was published in.
The actual full title, just before we continue.
Yes.
Yunseo, the full title of this in Korean?
난장이가 쏘아 올린 작은 공. Yeah.
A little ball shot by a dwarf.
Or 난소공.
Yeah.
For short. Yeah.
It's a fascinating title.
Yeah.
Just alone. The English, just the dwarf it's not enough, is it? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, That's one of the whole book, the whole title of or the whole collection of stories that's one of the short stories in that, right? I think the Dwarf, they just particularly Bruce and Juchan Fulton, their translation, they just shortened it to the Dwarf to make it more, zippy or whatever. Interesting title. But I think also there's a word, or in my opinion, there might be a concern with the use of 난장이, because it's sometimes been translated as midget, which is not necessarily politically correct anymore. So dwarf is much more acceptable in the sort of zeitgeist of at least English translation things.
Is 난장이 still acceptable today in polite society?
Yes, because it just, as a Korean, it feels like 7 dwarfs from Snow White or something.
Right, right. Okay. Yeah, see, that makes sense. But yeah, I think because of English, we have like the sort of derogatory now words that you just sort of, dwarf is just much more easier for people to pass along, but yeah, anyway, the story focuses on a family of a dwarf who live in a panjacheon, so like a shanty town on the outskirts of a factory. They live in an unlicensed shack, more or less, that's built along on the outskirts of the factory, and it circles on their lives and their interactions with labor and with sort of what's the word? Exploitation, both in a laboring sense, but in a sexual sense, and all these things. And it shows the distinct approaches that classes had to solve different issues that were occurring. There's a great scene that's written like a play. The union has organized to haggle or negotiate with the managers, and it's written like a play with the dialogue back and forth. And it's so great because it's such a divided scene, and it gets to the point where they're just talking past each other, and it's so spot on about how things would actually go in these sort of negotiating things. Like, you have the masses, but we have the money, so who's gonna, and then it just sort of like gets into a thing about like, oh, well, anyway, what are we doing later today? Like, it's just, it's just sort of, it's nonchalant from the managerial side, and the worker side are, well, it's back to work now because, whatever. And it's really amazing to see that written about how things are represented, how things are, to me, how things actually were. And this type of novel, according to Young-ju, who's a very great scholar at University of Michigan, this type of work is I believe it's repo, like reportage type novel, which was Chosei. Like, he would travel around with his camera and take pictures of panjacheon and like really be engaged in this sort of like journalistic way of writing. And the novel just fascinated me, and I wanted to get more into it. So
it's amazing because I haven't read this. It's one of these, I have to hold my hands up and go, I haven't got there yet. I know I need to. But Yunseo, you've read it?
Yes, I did.
But you read it very differently. You read it first.
Yeah, it was very different because for me, it was not a very novel artwork for me. It was the material for class.
Right.
Yeah. So like our teacher would bring the book and assign us to buy the book, like each person. And we just had to memorize the lessons of the book or summarizing the plots of the book in a certain way that the teacher wanted. Or the KSAT wants.
Right.
So we understood that there was a difficulty during that time. Like the poor families do not living very happily in the shanty town, and their dream won't be true even in the Seoul. Those kind of struggles, but we did not really feel it, which is very different from your approach on the novel. So sorry, I actually had a chance to talk about the Nan So-gong, the novel, with my friends yesterday, and all of our friends just agreed that it was just a KSAT thing. Like, we didn't really empathize or like feel the novel. We just had to memorize it, which is the reason why we forgot about all the plots.
It's amazing that, you know, the young people of today, there's this novel and it doesn't move you. And then somebody the other side of the world reads it and go, yes, the people.
Right.
That's the power of literature, though, I think. And sometimes that's one of the fascinating things where you think you're getting something like that speaks Korean or that's very authentic, and you come here and you speak to Korean people and they're like, oh my God, that thing.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it would be similar for a lot of, say, Americans who have to read Moby Dick.
To Kill a Mockingbird.
Right, To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yeah.
To just get through, maybe they have to take the GRE for grad school or something, and, you know, you just have to have this sort of broad knowledge of American literature. Okay, Emerson and, you know, Melville and then Hemingway. And, you know, it's like, okay, this is sort of survey of stuff I just have to memorize. Yeah.
Do you know anything about the author, Cho Se-hee?
Yeah, Cho Se-hee.
It wasn't sort of like class tourism then. It wasn't like, let's
no.
It's just because I like that term, I think I wanted to use it. But do you know what I mean? Let's go and investigate the poor people for a while. Who is Cho Se-hee?
He actually recently just passed away last year. Yeah, about a year ago now. And what's to tell about him? I don't know much about his upbringing besides the whole, you know, just learning in strictly Korean, which actually I should be doing much more research about him. But I do know that there's again with this Professor Yu from Michigan, talked about, there's a sort of story about him that he was recently asked, I think, about some sort of celebratory thing about his book, like it was the year or something, or sold so many copies. Anyway, he was at this book event, and they asked him during the lecture, you know, what do you think about this book? You know, your first big book being so popular again, and, you know, 40 years later or whatever. And he goes, well, that's not a good thing. Like, I didn't write this book to hope that everything would still be the same, if not worse. And now he's like, it's not necessarily a good thing. I'm paraphrasing, but it's, you know what I mean? He was very, it seemed like he was very conflicted about the treasuring of his book. You know, this was not a guide to the future about how we should be divided in classes. So I think that was a very fascinating little sort of story about him. But his upbringing, I'm not too sure about him specifically.
When you talk about the future, I mean, is that where we see sort of Bong Joon-ho's work? And is he? Right. Do we see influence there going on that?
I think so.
The class struggles and things like this were being played out in the 70s. People were talking about class and the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, things like this, that there was class consciousness during the 70s.
Very much so, yes. I think there's a lot of influence from specifically, I think, the 1970s, going into the 80s, about class consciousness and being very aware of, hey, wait a minute. Okay, supposedly we do have these things. We have things now. Yet other people don't, and it's very, very exasperated now. It's much worse for a lot of people. So much so that we have to invent 반지하s. You know, we have to have these things to house people underground, so that we can provide shelter for them. But they are poor, so they can't afford to live above ground. Very much a thing in Parasite, right?
Yeah.
And that the class distinction. So I think there's a lot of influence, but it's not necessarily so well known. I think if you asked a person who saw Parasite, do you know about this issue from 50 years ago? And I would say they probably don't know. But
one of the interesting things for me, maybe because I'm British and we're a little bit more sensitive or conscious of class, perhaps, is that if you give me somebody's name or their accent, we might be able to guess which socio-economic strata. So if you say Benedict Cumberbatch and then you hear his voice, I'm going to go, well, he's clearly from a certain class.
Right.
If you get a Korean name, Kim Ji-hye, Park Won, I have no idea what class they might be.
Right.
And that's really because they were so demarcated by class for 500 years, if not more. But they were very distinct classes and different Yangband, but they would have different roof tiles, colors on their house, wear different clothes. And then all of a sudden you're all equal. Just telling everybody you're all equal, but they realize they're not. And you can't distinguish them necessarily by accent as much or by name. And it's really different how it plays out here, and maybe that's one of the reasons why beauty becomes a thing, because they demarcate. You know, the rich people are generally very pretty. You know, that's how you can. Yunseo, are you able to tell people's class? I know it's a very sensitive thing, but you're able to look at people and go, really rich, that person definitely Yangband, that person's that. Or is class a thing in South Korea?
Not really, but people like to be seen as a rich people, but there is a thing in like Western countries, the old money aesthetics, right?
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Old money looker is really popular these days.
But I don't think that aesthetic is a thing in Korea. But I'm the person who think that being a pretty people in Korea is a privilege thing, a little bit in a way. And a lot of the K-pop celebrities are pretty and they're rich. And maybe people would think them being a rich people, like in their mind. 무의식적으로.
Yeah, subconsciously.
Yeah, subconsciously. So, as you said, the beauty being maybe a class thing in Korea, maybe that. Like not a money indirect way, but like in roundabout way, beauty may be the class in Korea.
I'm not sure whether I should be flattered or terrified by the fact you had enough faith in my Korean to look at me and go,
Sorry.
ask me. I'm glad I had the answer for you. But yeah, it's different how these class things plays out because class is, I think, very sensitive here because talk of class is associated generally with sort of maybe communism and Marxism and all of the things that go north of the border.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think now, and this is such a multifaceted phenomena or issue with the sort of multicultural aspect of it. Now we introduce different, nationalities, ethnicities, races. Now we're structuring in a multifaceted way, in a very multi-structural way, how to it's becoming very difficult, I think, in South Korea. And I think South Korea, the government, for better or for worse, is trying to deal with how do we approach multicultural education, 다문화 교육, and it's a struggle, I think, from what I've seen and heard from people who are studying it, because it's very new. How do you you have people from Southeast Asia. How do we incorporate them? And there's one of the big issues is, at least in my humble opinion, a lot of effort is made to Koreanize them. Yeah. How do we incorporate them into our society, rather than value their contributions and their ethnicities and practices? How do we not just accommodate, but how do we integrate them into us? Which historically doesn't really work, but that's the reality of it. There's more people coming, and they have to deal with it. So when you introduce more classes, you're obviously going to have more problems and different races. And it's just human nature, I think. And the thing with the Dwarf is, it deals with just Korean people, right? It doesn't really deal with any sort of multicultural issues. It's just a class thing.
Whether you're rich or poor, you're all still Korean.
Right. You all have this sort. The Han people, right? Like 대한민국, like, you know, that sort of, it's there, right? It's palpable, but not so much anymore. I think maybe some people are hanging on to it, other people are not.
I'm confident of the future, and I think one of the next columns I will write will be about South Korea's possible ethnic revolution. They've had an economic revolution. They've had a political revolution. They've had a cultural revolution. They've had those three. They definitely have. You know, completely transforming their society from agricultural to modern, from autocratic or dictatorship to democracy, from totally uncool to wow, mad cool. And now the next one will be, well, to be Korean means to be ethnically Korean, like 단일 민족. But I think that might also go through a revolution. Many people look at me and go, and it might not. But then you might blink your eyes and all of a sudden there's brown Koreans and white Koreans.
Right.
I don't mean to use these terms, you know, flippantly, but it's possible that might happen. Before we go on to Hwang Sok-yong, is Han a thing? Can we open up this little can of worms? So, like, in literature, there's this big thing, and I think there's a thing in Sunung as well, but Han as this indescribable sense of Korean sadness that permeates through the literature. I think it was Goon the poet, I'm not sure if we're allowed to say his name anymore, but Goon the poet said, "We are born in the bosom of Han," or something like this. Your take on Han as something in Korean literature? Is it there? Is it visible? Is it self-orientalism? Does Yunseo have Han?
I'd be very interested to hear how is that taught it now. I mean, from what I've never focused on that in my particular research. I'm aware of it. I've never seen it written in a sort of like at least in like a scholarly journal or book about Korean literature. I've never seen it. I don't think it's because that might be an issue of how do we relate this to the readership who's not ethnically Korean, who doesn't know what Han is, you know, because I have a page limit and I can't, you know, I'm talking about this book. I can't talk about Han. I think it's...
You know what it is, though, because it comes up in mainstream media quite a lot. The Han of Squid Game and such forth, you know.
I think generally it's there, but I think it's a difficult... As a reader, I think it does get lost in other issues that are much more immediate. You know, but that's just my research. When I focus on, say, Marxism or something, I'm focused on socioeconomic things rather than a historically ethnic, you know, a Korean thing, Koreanness, which does come up, but I think in different ways. Because you could also say, like, oh, what about the Jung of the people too? You know,
the nunchi of the Gukmin.
Right. So I think it's always there, but in the background. But I don't know if I've ever seen anything from research on 1970s literature that talks about Han, and I don't know if that's, like I said, an issue of just readership interest, or if scholars want to go outside of a specifically Korean, I don't want to affect, I think you could call it. I don't know. I'm not too sure. But it's a very interesting question.
This might be a little bit academic. I might have to ask Jacko Zwetslute about this later this evening. But I wonder if Han is compatible with the North Korean framework. I wonder if they teach Han in North Korea as being part of the Korean identity, or whether they see it as like a sign of false consciousness to keep people down, because there is this idea that it was invented by the Japanese to keep the Korean people subjugated and suppressed. And but so I wonder if Han is compatible with sort of a Marxist or a class-oriented framework or not. But Han's definitely... I always feel that Han's associated with Korean literature, wrongly or rightly. Is Han still a thing in 2023? Do you feel Han deep in your Yonghon Yunseo? Is it like shut up? I don't know. What's your personal take on it?
We do know the term Han, but as I said before with the Nansogong thing, like when I ask like hundreds of Korean students of the Han, they would possibly say that all of the students would say, oh, the SAT thing, okay, they would say that. And yeah, I think that I personally think that Han is not a very Korean thing. Like, I think that if we all three get through the same pain, we can get Han. And as in the novel that you recommended, 난소공 or 풀잎처럼 눕다, I can feel the Han, but it's not a very the only Korean thing. But if you ask Korean people about Han, they would give you all different answers, right? Like people by people, because in the school they teach you Han with a very abstract way. It's a sadness, but it has something with like traditional sadness or something like that, and that is the all that we learn in school. So yeah, maybe the answers would.
What would your dad say if you asked him about Han? You say
Han. Okay.
Han. Well, if you asked him if it was real, what's Han? Do you have any idea? Could you predict or?
He would maybe say the Korean people's sadness coming from the same pain, something like that.
Yeah. It's fascinating to me that Han seems to be disappearing. That it's not right. You know, it's, whether it was there or not. Because a lot of my, and I say this with no disrespect, my international students, when they hear about this, they're like, "That's fascinating. That's amazing. I want to learn about Han because it sounds like this magical concept, this mystical thing to unlock the key of Korean people." And I'm going to, which is what you're not doing, but I'm going to analyze Parasite through Han.
Right.
I'm going to watch The Glory and learn about the Korean people's Han. You know, but it's when you speak to young people, they're like, no.
Yeah. I'm not sure how far it would get you though, as a researcher. I think that it is quite limited in a sense that. I mean, because you have to follow along with the zeitgeist of the literature or the research. You know, how relevant is Han going to be to somebody from Alabama reading your material, or from Northern England or some, you know, whatever. I think it's something that, yes, it does maybe just have a hold in South Korea, but I don't know what its place would be in an academic sense. I'm not exactly sure.
Maybe Korean writers are not necessarily always writing for Korean audiences as much anymore.
That's true.
You know,
right.
when if you're Hangang or something like this, and you know you've got an international readership and people all around the world, there's no point always just. She wrote a book called. Oh no, Hangang wrote the White Book, not that one. From Han to Hwang Sok-yong, because before we talked, I never realized that there was such a Frederick Jameson Marxist class-conscious approach to your work. It wasn't evident in that file that you sent.
Oh no!
I'm not sure if you were hiding,
I have to rewrite
that. It's not a Hwang Sok-yong. Maybe before we talk about his work, say anything about the person, because this is a figure that if you say in Korean society, you'll get like a look of admiration, or you'll get a look of or something like this, right? So maybe, do you have anything to say about Hwang Sok-yong, the author? He's still alive.
Yeah, still alive. I think he's just turned 80. I think. I would say he's a mover. He's maybe not so much anymore with his age, but known very well for constantly moving. Whether he wanted to or not. I mean, he was in exile and things like that in New York for a while. But yeah, he always seemed to be at the front line of protest or of resistance or something in the 70s and 80s. And yeah, I think his research or his work reflected a movement never fully being settled. I think it was always contesting something about the development of South Korea when he was writing, and still I think there was like a type of anxiety, I would say, in his writing that is something he's unsatisfied. There's something that we have to keep doing, have to keep moving, have to keep doing something. And I think, yeah, he's a very interesting fella. He's been on like TV shows recently, and he's like on comedy shows and stuff. And
I've not seen him on.
Yeah,
Really? Wow.
Somewhat recently too. Yeah, and he's, a good storyteller, obviously, on even at his age now on these shows and stuff. And he's a very interesting character. As a person, I think he's also quite a character. But
he was obviously he was put in jail for going to North Korea, for sneaking into North Korea by plane and going there and being very unrepentant about it, saying, that's my home. I'm not, that's where I'm from. Why am I in trouble for doing this?
Right.
I'm not going to North Korea. I'm going home.
Right.
That's some of the message that he was trying to get out in his autobiography, which I read. But that's when politics, I think, sometimes gets in the way of art, or it gets in the way of writing or what he was doing, because there's a man that wants to write about home. He wants to write about things, the land, where he's from, but then he can't. He's constantly in exile. Even in South Korea, he's in exile. I think he said something like that he's an orphan.
Yeah.
Nationally,
right.
In that sense, he doesn't have a home,
right?
Which is kind of a sad existential thing to go through, but it probably produces great literature. Sadly,
yeah, I think that's very common in not just his work, but in a lot of works from this period too. Is the concept of being unable to return back home is very much a thing during this time. And even if like Sampo 가는 길, which I'm sure you're familiar with for the Sunung, either the movie or the book, but even if you can return home, even if you can return to somewhere your goyang, like it's not going to look the same. So therefore, it's really not your goyang anymore. And that's, like I said, it's like that sort of palpable thing in his. That runs through his work, I think, at least from this time. This idea that, well, how can I not return to this place that I was? And now he did, and he got in trouble for it. So because of these sort of arbitrary boundaries of nation. So, yeah, that's very... I think he's very well known for that. And if that's Han, then maybe I would... agree. Then I would say that.
I think it was in his autobiography that I read the line, if I were a president going there, I would be awarded with a Nobel Peace Prize, but because I'm a writer, I'm put in jail.
Right.
And I kind of felt that if the president went to North Korea, people would put him on television and say, well, hero, he's advocating peace. Right. This is brilliant. But as a writer, when he does exactly the same thing, he's considered a terrorist or a danger to the nation in that sense.
Because he did it under the radar. He didn't do it on a national scale on TV, and like Moon Jae-in did when he crossed the 38th.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, this is so great. Well, how come other people can't do it? Like it's,
What was it? What are some of those books like from the time? Because I recently read At Dusk, which is a 2018 novel. Well, that's the English one. I don't know when the original Korean, but that was given to me by M, who we talked about earlier. She came up and she said, "Professor, take this book. Thank you very much." And I loved it. And that was all about shanty towns and really people living not just below the poverty line, but living in a completely different world almost, different values and different aesthetics. What was his 70s writing? Why did you choose Tizzard, a tape measure, and The Neighbor? 어떤 사람? 룻사람?
이웃 사람. Yeah.
Okay.
When you do it Mykyun Reischauer,
the romanization is terrible. I was thinking like Lut.
Yeah. No. I chose the Mykyun Reischauer system because for me it's easier to read. But when you have 이웃 사람, it's lut 사람. Yeah. I chose these works because they fit into my research and what I was aiming for. But so Julita, the tape measure, is about a neighborly argument that turns into something that the law has to get involved, and it's over what essentially turns out to be like, I think it's like 15 or 18, something like that, centimeters of land between the neighbors, and it's because of the sort of awning of one neighbor hangs over the property of the other neighbor.
Mm.
And I think in those times, I can't remember the name of the measurement, but it's like basically your hand measurement. It's like 2 of those, something like that. It's a ridiculous amount of space. And yeah, it turns into this huge thing about property and the, private property versus public, and when these disputes come into, when they're written in a contract, how do we deal with these things? And now, well, it's written in my contract, so I have these rights. These are my private rights, and then when does that escalate to be, to have to get the law involved, and the policemen have to come and enforce this contract that was sort of arbitrary, and it leads to, it's just this huge, this mountain out of a molehill kind of thing that really emphasizes like, okay, we're building a lot in the city area, and we want these people to be happy because they have private property and blah, blah, blah. And yet, because we're human, because we have these instinctual things about this is mine, that's yours, it's this such a minuscule amount of land becomes this huge thing where this guy ends up in jail because he doesn't want to secede. So it's, sorry for the spoilers, but it's a nice detail about that sort of part of society. And I believe that story was 71, 72. So yeah, right at the beginning of the 70s, very economic boom. We're making money. People are buying houses, and it's not just a patte, it's like a house, so it's whatever. So that was that story. And then the other one, Iutsaram, also about, that one actually deals with blood donations. And this guy is a Vietnam veteran, very much like Hwang Sok-yong, and comes back, and he comes back to Seoul with no job, no money, whatever. His body's been used in the military complex, and comes back, and he lives in basically a shelter, homeless shelter, where he says like they're packed in cages like dogs, and one of the fellow homeless men says to him, "Why don't you donate blood? They pay money." And so he gets sort of addicted to this, and then he ends up finding a rich guy, not surprisingly, who, when he donates blood, he goes to his house, and they're lying supine on their backs, and the blood is going out from him into the machine into the old guy. It's a sort of like really affective, like sort of moment, and it's really just a strong imagery of like this lifeblood is being it's vampiric. It's this old guy he's at death's door almost, but yet he has so much money that he can pay for these people to come into his home, and he feeds them, gives them like almost like a buffet, like when you're fattening a pig before the slaughter, and that's the sort of story, and he sort of gets addicted to that, and he becomes so drained literally of his blood and his the ownership of his body, this sovereignty that he might have had. Now he doesn't really have a trace of it, and he ends up murdering a stranger on the street because he's so out of his mind, with maybe Han. Maybe that's where that comes in again. No,
Hwang, I think is the Korean one, isn't it?
So there's a lot, and there's other aspects of like this sort of loss of sexual desire, like he becomes emasculated, kind of castrated kind of thing, and he so there's the phallic imagery of the knife and everything like that. But in general, it's this sort of the sucking lifeblood out of the poorer individuals to feed those on the other end of the spectrum.
Especially the Vietnam veterans as well, or something. That's a nice added twist to it. It's a nice semi-autobiographical twist, right. I think, from Hwang Sok-yong, because I think these conversations tie into that idea about the miracle of the Han River and everything's great. And we talked about the girls have to go into the factories, but the men had to go into the military, and the men had to go to Vietnam, and to all of these things for the success to happen.
Yeah, it's and then you have stories like Jeon Tae-il with the dormitories and the horrible conditions that they had to go through and things like that. You know, it's around. These things are in the history. It's just not really talked about as much.
Jeon Tae-il is I believe he was 19 at the time. In 1970, he ran down where is now the Cheonggyecheon, ran down the street saying, "We are not machines." He self-immolated, set himself on fire, and cried, "We are not machines," in order to bring better working conditions for the people in the factory. I took some of my students to go and see his statue there.
Right.
It's quite moving to go and see it. And it still took a long time for those works.
Oh, yeah.
For those improvements in labor rights and things like that to come. It took a very long time.
By the way, I think that the 이웃 사람 sucking out the live blood is the like genius allegory thing, because in Korea there is a phrase that 혈세, which means like a tax which is valuable as our blood, because there are like high status people who gets our tax to their money, right? And maybe poor people or like lower class people would feel as if their bloods are sucking out because of the rich people. And we also say 피 같은 돈 in our daily lives, which is like the money as valuable as our blood.
Right.
And I think that during that time, the novel times, I think that would felt in the heart more desperately. So I think that it's a genius thing.
I love those insights. Do you have any thoughts on Hwang Sok-yong in general? Like as a writer, you don't know much about him, or?
I'm not very proud to say this, but I have like not really enough knowledge for him.
I'm just curious, like if we were to say Korean authors, like 그냥 대한민국 작가 or 소설, who would your mind immediately go to? Like if an international friend asked you, who are some Korean authors? So you wouldn't say Hwang Sok-yong, right? But that's fun, because maybe I would.
I'm glad you're asking that, because I'm very
who
curious too.
Would you say anything? I don't know.
Maybe, I don't know if it is because of the time era we are talking, but the person pops up in my mind is maybe Isang. Maybe he just embodied the paralyzing minds of the desperate, struggling era very well. So maybe that's why.
Now, I can't remember. I've read Isang, and I find it his work very out there, very modern, very little structure. I remember one of my students at the time, her name was Taylor Woody from Wellesley College, and she was like, "Professor, you've got to read Dictee." I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right. Who wrote Dictee?
Teresa Hakyoung-cha.
Yeah, she was like, "You've got to read Dictee." And so she kept going on at me, "Have you read Dictee yet?" And on my Insta, I was like, "No." So I finally read it, and I was like, "What the bloody hell is this?" You know, like,
are you familiar with Dictee?
Not really.
Okay.
I wonder if just international people like it more than Korean people, because it's written. It's just, I'm not even sure if it's not a novel, is it? Is it? It's very hard to describe Dictee. It's like a journal. It's like somebody's journal of aphorisms and practicing French, if I remember correctly now, and all of that. You can't put Dictee into this?
No, I think Dictee. I would consider that more Asian American literature.
Okay.
Even though obviously she's Korean. I think ethnically Korean, but I think she's born and raised in the States.
She passed away, didn't she?
Yeah, she had a horrible death.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, in 1980, when she was I think the book came out like 2 weeks before, and then she was murdered in New York City. Fascinating book that involves it's this sort of stream of consciousness, but also French lessons, and but then there's a diagram of there's a lot of hanja in it too, and there's a diagram of the sort of what's the word, like traditional Chinese medicine, like a diagram of the body and where like specific acupuncture points, like, and it's just randomly there on the page, and you have to sort of interpret it and where does it fit with this half narrative kind of thing. But also talks about Korean liberation and the what's the word, Samil Undong, and things like that. So it's a very much a mixture of internationalism and American stuff mixed with Korean traditional thinking and stuff. I don't know. It's difficult to describe, but I do recommend it.
It's completely out there, and I think international students really like it. If you ever get somebody, what should I read? Dictate is one that you pick it up and you definitely remember it.
Yeah,
it's something that you'll love it or you'll hate it, but it's very hard not to have an opinion on this book, I think.
I remember reading it in undergrad and being like, what the hell is this? I don't understand this. Because it's sometimes there's just a bunch of dates, June 30th, 1974 or something. And you're like, okay. And then next page, and it's the diagram of like the acupuncture stuff. But then I reread it actually in the last couple of years, and I found it amazing. And I was like, oh, I'm so glad I got to read this again.
You mentioned like the acupuncture points on the body. One of my friends said to me the other day, he wants to be a hanisa. He wants to be a Haniwon doctor. I'm not sure how to say this, like an alternative medicine, oriental medicine doctor. I'm not sure what the correct term is, but hanisa, I think, is the Korean term. Wants to be one of those. And I was like, wow, people still do that. And when my son had indigestion the other day, first they rub really hard the space in between your thumb and forefinger, and it really hurts. And some people, you can press as hard as you can, and they just look at you and go, what? It doesn't make them flinch at all. And then if it really continues, they'll take your blood. They'll like prick your blood and things like this. Honey one's still a thing? When you talk to your friends about the dwarf and things like that, do you ever tell your friends, should we go to a honey one? Was it something like dum or things like that? Is that still a thing amongst young people, honey ones?
Haniwon is not really considered as an old thing.
Okay.
It is still a thing.
Okay.
Because I heard that when you go to Haniwon, they just do not really pick a part of body that you are hurting, and they just look for the reason why you are feeling pain in specific area. So they just counsel you for an hour, and they just look through your body with like heart pulse or something like that. Yeah, and even I went to Haniwon for like 3 or 4 times. Yeah, it's very common nowadays even.
Wow.
Yeah, that's still very interesting to me. And what I heard is one of the first things they do besides the pulse thing is they also check your tongue.
Yeah.
To see, like, that's one of the first checks. Did they check your child's?
I haven't been to a honey one in a while. Did they check tongues? Okay.
Yeah. Like, there's a sort of, that's like one of the signs.
Okay.
Of, and if they don't check it, then that's not a good honey.
It's not a good honey.
Like, that's sort of like the typical price. That's what I've heard.
Everybody in my family, they're always brushing their tongue. You can hear them, they go to brush their teeth, and they just go, they're just gagging.
Right.
And then I told them, I don't know why I told them this, do you know that if you squeeze the thumb of your left hand, if you squeeze your thumb with your left hand, while you do that, it cancels your gag reflex. So if you do that and then brush your tongue, you won't gag. And so I told them that, and then all that sound that was coming just stopped.
Oh.
And there you go. You can cancel your... It's very useful if you need to
Interesting.
drink a shot or something like that. But yeah, it is.
For other purposes,
you can cancel your gag reflex by squeezing your left thumb. Go home with your toothbrush and go and test it. But that's that one.
I had never heard that either.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm interested. Yeah, the honey one thing, and just in general, like this sort of traditional aspect of, how much. I mean, we can talk about this later or whatever. But how much do you think that traditional aspect of your life now part of it? I mean, doljanchi or like these very sort of, I'm interested in that idea of like the Koreanness of things, like because we have K-pop and K-dramas and things, but like the K obviously is Korea, South Korean, right? So, but so the Korean things that are there, is there like an awareness or a consciousness of that still?
Because that's really Korean. doljanchi is really Korean.
Right,
to me.
right.
So, any thoughts on that?
I'm just curious.
Yeah, we do have 돌잔치s or like 제사
Right.
in like traditional days,
Right.
the ceremonies, but nowadays that kind of like heavily traditional things are diminishing in a way because like on national holidays of Korea, most of the people would go on vacation or something.
Yeah, right.
Japan.
Right. right. Yeah. Because the traffic is so bad here that
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see lots of people doing doljanchis, and so doljanchi is 1 year, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's also the 100-day one people
Right.
do.
Yeah.
I see more and more people doing those at home,
Right.
and they'll rent the stuff. They'll just go on to whatever it is, Tangan or whatever, G Market, and they get sent a thing and they just put it up on their wall.
Yep.
And they sit there, they take the photos and they send it all back. And then you don't need to rent this big space and have everybody come because everybody's busy. So I think some people do it, but the method of doing it is changing.
Yeah.
I'll tell you one very quick story about our doljanchi for my son Edward when he was born. And a doljanchi in Korea, people will lay out. Do you know what you picked at your doljanchi?
Yes, I picked money.
Your parents must have been very happy and proud of you because they'll lay out different things like the gavel and the pencil and money and the string and they all represent different things in your life. So the string will represent long life. My brother sent over James Hetfield's pick, who's the lead guitarist, not lead guitarist, rhythm guitarist of Metallica.
Yep.
He went to a concert. He was out there, caught the pick. He loved Metallica, and I listened to Metallica growing up. Sent it over. We put them all down, and my wife was like, "If he chooses that pick, you know, I'm so angry. You know, he's got to pick money."
Yeah.
And Edward was just like, "Yes," he went straight to the pick. And I'm just standing there celebrating, and just my wife and her family just looking at me, "Oranke, you barbarian." But it'd be interesting how they fit into the new Korea. You're right, because that's something that we don't do. We don't do those things, but they do them here. The ancestor worship, the Tizzard, the Chale.
Right. Yeah, the Jaesa is still important, I think, which is, and to me, and this is one of the things that, and I hope that it's not sort of Orientalist thinking, but in a way, as an American, to see these sorts of things is so interesting to me because in the States, we just really don't have these things. Unless you're from an ethnically or different place. If you're Mexican American maybe or whatever, you have that sort of history, but typical whatever people we just don't. You know, you have the sort of like Easter, Christmas, Catholics, you know, that kind of thing or whatever. But we don't have anything that represents this sort of traditional type of thing. And maybe it's because we're so mixed ethnically or traditionally, and then they just sort of fade away as things get mixed. Or it's because we're a relatively new place, like as a nation. I don't know. It's a mixture of everything. So that's why I'm interested in what you were saying, because as a foreigner, it's very interesting that these traditions are continuing, and I think that's very cool. And I think that's just my opinion. But
I'm not sure how much Chesa and Chale, the ancestor worship, is continuing. I think for most people, it's well on the way out. I think if I had a class of 30 Korean students, I would say somewhere between 5 and 10 would do it. That would, I don't know about you, but do you think many people do it now?
Not really. Like, we do have the sense of our ancestors, but we do not really practice that in daily life. Or the 제사 thing feels like a very conservative thing to me because it's too traditional.
Yeah. I think there's a gender thing going on as well.
Yeah.
There.
Yeah, because like most of the women would work for the 제사.
Yeah, right.
And most of the men would just do the ceremony thing.
Yeah, drunk.
They would do the performance, but not really doing things for
Yeah, that's interesting how just things turn out, especially with the introduction of, or I should say like sort of insertion of capitalistic practices to doldanchi. Oh, now there's a market for renting these things. You know, somebody's capitalizing on that and making a lot of money on this sort of traditional thing, and and that's just the way things are now. You know, renting hanbok or something.
Yeah, I mean, who wears a hanbok anymore? When do you do this? And I know if I take photos of our kids in hanboks or something like that, it just looks amazing. And yes, and I think that there's this. I'm going to do a podcast on this in the future, but so many young Koreans want to tell Joseon. They want to just leave Joseon. And then so many international people like, I want to go to Korea. You've got this huge, and they all want to go and come to different places because of different reasons. And that fascinates me. Yeah. When you read all of these novels and you selected them, short stories from the 70s, there's things in there that have gone missing today. So we're talking about doljanchi, and that's passing out, but honey ones are still there, and they've survived, which is interesting. From these novels, do you read stuff and you can, that could happen today, or what do you read things and go, well, that's really different, that's really old?
I think the straight answer for that would be I've just been, hopefully you can tell, I'm very interested in space. And so one of the things that I can at least somehow connect with is when, you know, Dongdaemun or something, or Tongno is written in these texts, I can actually go to that place or go to that Dong, that neighborhood, and see what it's like now. Because chances are it's just vastly different, unless you go to the very old parts of Seoul, but even there. So I would say just everything's different. Most of it is, you know, it's just, I can't go, maybe if some place or some story mentioned Gyeongbokgung, but even that's been different. I mean, that was, you know, when did the Governor General building get taken down? 1997?
Something like that. Kim Young-sam, Kim Dae-jung transition time.
So even Gyeongbokgung is different, you know, from whatever. So yeah, it's I don't know. I think just everything would be different. I don't know if there's specific things that I can see currently.
I don't know. We'll come on to space. Yeah. Just before we do that, in terms of the writers, because we haven't mentioned them all, but say like I've only got them written here in English, which is terrible of me. So Choi In-hun. Oh, thank you. Park Bum-shin. These are male.
Yes.
So
I was waiting for this part.
No, this is not a criticism, but I think now when you think about Korean literature, a lot of it to me seems feminist in nature, and I think that reflects how society is changing and how people's desires are changing. The Korean dramas now, a lot of them are written by female writers, and that's changing. Anything on like the identity, were there female writers at the time? Was it harder to write them, or they weren't doing the class thing as well as the men? Or because, you know, if you're choosing a selection of writers now, you have to have a balance and identity and rah.
I actually did have, and I hope to do this sometime when I actually get to read her longer works. Park Hwan-so was a writer that I have worked with in the past, and I couldn't get what I wanted for my research out of Namok, out of the Naked Tree, so I had to unfortunately cut it.
But that's a good thing to do, by the way.
Yeah. But I will say that current research is going on about this particular time and the male-dominant sense of the literature at this, especially the late 70s with the Minjung movement and things like that, where it became so masculine. And now a lot of people are looking back and saying, was this really liberation? Like, was this really liberation for the workers? What about the women? There weren't a lot of women involved. Or at least, I mean, the women were writing, but a lot of people weren't reading their stuff. So how do we understand that? So I will hopefully end up working with at least one female writer, but I think in Park Hwan-so's case, much of her work that I really enjoy is, at least in part, autobiographical, where and I think that's her strength, and I think that's how she resonated with a lot of people. I think she was arguably, if not now, still one of the most popular female writers.
She's a towering figure, isn't she?
In South Korea. And yet, when she's really only considered as a female writer of the 1970s and you know what I mean? It's not. She's not a writer. She's a female writer, and so I think the research now that's being done is questioning that, and why, especially with feminism and things like that. How can we approach this differently? How can we look at her work? Because much of it is gender focused, because a lot of it is autobiographical, but that's not it, right? That's not where it stops. It's much more than that. She has a lot of things to say about gender roles, specifically the place of the woman in, say, the household. That's not every woman's dream, what do we do? How can we get out of that restrictive role and be in the workforce or be whatever? That's not a factory worker. Those types of issues are addressed, and I'm hoping to get into her work more. But
Lee Nam-hee, who wrote Making of the Minjung 만들기.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, really good book. I'm sure you must have read that. But in that, she mentions, I believe it's in that book, she talks about the women being the lowest of the lows. So, there's all these different stratas of society, but women were always at the bottom of that, in the way she saw this popular uprising movement. And I'm not sure if this is the correct way to see it, but sometimes when I go through my lectures and I talk about concepts of like queer blindness and things like this, maybe gender blindness, that there were gender issues and there were LGBT issues and all these things going on in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. But overarching above all of those things, there was the need for modernization or the need for democratization. There was a national goal that sort of superseded every other problem. And now those things have been solved to a certain extent. Now they've been achieved. It's like, okay, now we can do that.
Right.
Now we can do that. I mean, this is not the way I'm saying it should be. This is one of the ways I tried to understand what was going on in the past, that it's now we've solved what's the good of having gender equality if we're living in poverty? What's the good of having gay rights if we're living under a dictator?
Right.
That kind of thing. So you get the groundwork laid first, and now, as we can see in Korean society, those things are certainly not perfect, but they're making progress, I would say.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting how, and I think that it is a specifically South Korean problem in its own way, but I think that especially with more, say, recent developments of nations in the last, say, 50, 60, 70 years, especially post-World War II, right? The sort of Cold War era where we have a bunch of new nations. And so, okay, we develop the nation as a whole first. We put this guy in charge and whatever. And then only once these things are set up, now we can approach, sort of the secondary issues of gender rights or, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very interesting approach, right? Like, that keeps happening. And it's like...
Can you do it the other way around?
Yeah,
is it a law or...
Right. Is that... Because is that just a hegemonic view of, the West or specifically the U.S.? This is how you do it because it worked in these other countries, as in we gave them money to do so this way. So, it brings up a lot of issues.
If you take something like material values and then post-material values, or Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I know this will be setting off alarm bells for some, but people care about their physical well-being first, and once they have a job and once they have a house, once they have security, then they'll think, well, now I want equality, and now I want fairness, and these ideas often, certainly in South Korea, they've come from the elite universities first, where people have the economic background and psychological to explore these things, because if you're working in a factory, you haven't got the time or the well-being to focus on these things all the time. And if you consider that, it's like, well, if you want people to be equal, you've got to make them rich first. And that's a weird way to approach things, you know.
Right.
Did you read, I'm jumping here, but did you read The Whale?
No, actually, I'm just joined being part of like a book club for the Royal Society of Asia.
You'll get in trouble if you don't say that right.
Sorry.
The Royal Asiatic Society.
And the book meeting next time is The Whale.
Yeah.
So I will be reading that this month.
It's a good book. It's a good book club.
Okay.
The Royal Asiatic Society.
Yeah, I went to the last one and it was very good. So.
Yeah. The first time I gave a lecture for the Royal Asiatic Society, I stood there and there were British ambassadors there. Brother Anthony, and I said, "Well, thank you for inviting me to the Royal Asia Society." And Brother Anthony just went, "Asiatic," and I went, "Oh my god!" It was like the first sentence I said.
Here come the tomatoes.
Yeah, it was just so wrong. Shall we talk about space?
Sure.
Not 우주, 하지만 다른 space. A lot of your work focus on these 4 spaces.
Yes.
So you have all this literature. You're talking about space. Can you perhaps this is a very podcast word. Can you unpack space for us?
Can I unpack this? Yes. I became interested in the spatial turn or the spatial argument after reading a book, The New Asian City by Jenny Kim Watson, which I definitely recommend. And she does a comparative study of Cold War literature of Taiwan, or of Taipei, of Seoul, and Singapore, and in sort of a developmentalist way. And she talks about space and how we can reconsider or think about how space and the creation of spaces in a Cold War environment, in a developing nation, how those can matter in how we view the literature, and how her specific argument is, how do these new spaces create a specific type of text? How do these conditions inform how we write about them? And so I became very interested in that argument, and that's sort of use that as a springboard to investigate just these South Korean specific places.
The medium is the message.
Yeah.
Essentially, isn't it?
More or less,
how does that specific space create that?
Mm-hmm.
How does that form create that content?
Yeah.
So tell us about Korean space.
Yeah. So I found the Park Chung-hee period to be just the perfect mixture of the developmental, the industrial, the economic, all these things were being created at the same time. And my argument is my questioning is, how did individuals, albeit in a fictional way, navigate the creation of these spaces, and the how do they adjust to them? How were they like the dwarf and they had to meet their demise, or did they grow exponentially in wealth because of these creations? So I chose these specific 4 spaces for their, what I hope is a very South Korean way, but also can be seen on a global scale. So I think I try to do both. That was actually one of the criticisms from my committee. It's like, why is this specifically South Korean? And I want to engage with that specifically. So
tell me about the space of the psyche. So how you mentioned how the individuals navigate this new space. So I'll try to frame this question in 2 ways. First, I think that South Korea has transformed so rapidly and dramatically that some people will look around the country today and go, what is this place? They don't quite recognize it. It's been such a transformation that it's very hard, maybe even in evolutionary terms, for them to adapt to this new environment where everything is contactless and wireless and without human. It's untact is the word that they use. And also alongside this, I've said a couple of times, I'm not sure if it's me being dramatic, but when did Korean people become individualistic? When did Korean people start saying I? rather than 하지만 우리는, or just not using pronouns. When did this kind of individualism come to Korea that we're so used to? Because I've suggested at times maybe it's about 10 years old, 15 years old. And I'm not trying to suggest that there were no individuals before that, but where people said, no, I want to eat this, and so I'm going to eat that, and to the hell with all the rest of you. You know, I don't care about you.
Right.
How is individuals navigating this, and the psyche or the concept of individualism? Is that present in these novels or in space or?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I believe all of the works that I chose are not in first person. I think they were all in third person.
That's quite weird, isn't it?
Except for the Dwarf. I think some stories are first person, and I might be mistaken, but I think that's the case. But yeah, you still hear 우리나라, like it's or whatever.
우리 남편.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's a very interesting aspect, and I think what I tried to do with the space of the psyche, which is arguably or not arguably my the most experimental chapter that I'm trying to focus on, because I wanted to, you have all these things happening outside the individual. You have the development of companies, and you have chaebol, and you have life becomes very transactional. I go to this place, I pay a certain amount, and I get this service or this product, or the novel Kuboshi that I chose, Che In-hun, it's in a sense, it's and I don't mean this in a very downgrading way, but it's Joycean. It's very much like Ulysses, and the sort of meanderings of an individual who goes through these transactions and sees pretty girls on the bus, and he's a writer. He goes into companies and he writes a story for them. He gets money in exchange, and then, but what's interesting is that all these relationships are so clearly surface level that I was more interested about, okay, what happens in here in the brain after these transactions? How does he think about them? He sees this pretty girl on the bus. He doesn't go and talk to her. He just scolds himself for not doing it after she gets off on the, and it's these sorts of things. I wanted to go inside because so many things are happening outside. You have so much development, so much noise going on, which, thank you, I might use that in the future. But is it just as noisy in the inside? And in this book, it very much is. There's so much going on in his head now. And I think before this, at least in the works that I've read, we never really had this sort of very, very introspective psychological movement, except for the same book by Park Tae-won, this is arguably a rewriting of that book from 1930 something. But except for that one that I've read, and maybe Isang Wings, you don't really have a lot of that introspection. At the end of the day, how does an individual think about what he or she did during that day? And that's where I'm interested in. It's the private internal thoughts. And I wanted to make that a space because I think it can be created, especially with everything is so social now. Everything is very much engaged with uri and what are we doing as a society? You mentioned people staring at you outside. It's all very invasive, but what about me? How do I act at the end of the day when I'm alone with my thoughts? So yeah, I just wanted to see what would happen if I approached it that way. So yeah, and I think I recommend this text to anybody. Unfortunately, the translation when I read it is rocky.
That's a good word to describe that.
There's a lot of random, and I'm not trying to bash the translator or whoever they are, but it's very rocky. There's some words that are missing or things that are spelled wrong or something. It's this was done very hastily or something.
Yeah.
But anyway.
I'll just ask one thing.
Mm-hmm.
No, I'll just mention one thing is I've been watching a lot of K-dramas recently to prepare for my next Hallyu course on that. And also because my mum's been over and she likes watching dramas. And I've always noticed this in Korean dramas and Korean movies, but particularly the dramas, there's lots and lots of long shots of people's faces where nothing is said. And it's almost like a music video, and you've got the OST playing and things like this. But seriously, they're going on for like 2 minutes and nothing's being said, and you're just looking at the faces. And I think you're meant to interpret what people are feeling. You're meant to use your nunchi. It's all meant to be played out. Nothing's being said, but everything is being spoken.
Right.
So I think there's this thing that goes on. I've also this weekend I read Shogun by James Clavell. It's the first time I've read it. It's an amazing book. And in this book, which is about Blackthorn going to Japan in the 16th century, you know, into that society, you have these Japanese people. They'll have this conversation, but they'll say some words, but then the rest is said in their head, but not said out loud, because you've got to save face and not say those things out loud. And there's the reply. And these things are said in their head, but not said out loud. And it's this fascinating, here's the outside conversation and here's the inside conversation going on. And I was reading this going, this is a fascinating literary technique, because sometimes they're applying across the different forms and things like this. I also like asking my students, what's the inside of your head like? You know, is it noisy? And they're like, Professor, the voices won't shut up. We're like, what voices are they? And they're like, I've got 10. And some people are like, oh, it's... Before we come to voices, Yunseo, is there a change from, like, I mentioned that South Korea is becoming more individual. Maybe it's gone from an Uri society to a Na society or something. Do you have any thoughts on, no, we're still the Uri people, or no, we're individualism, or how is that for young people?
I think that being an individual self was been there since a long time ago, but I think that the social media played a role in people expressing themselves like very loudly online, because like maybe like 최인훈's 소설가 구보시의 1일, it was a novel, but if he just wrote that on Instagram, which was not possible at that time, but let's say he did that, like in these days, it would have been more popular and more people would have seen it. And other people would comment down on it and talk about things. But by that time, the book wasn't the media that people would interact with, like at the same time, right? So I think that the being the self thing being noisy nowadays is because of the media, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with that. For
Medium
sure.
is the messy.
Yes.
We're in the century of the self and the temple of the self and me and I. Yeah.
Right.
Which is the fascinating idea. The internet was meant to give us other people, but it just gave us us.
Right.
It just gave us me back at myself.
Right.
Yeah, this is what I like. This is what I do. Remember, I get in so much trouble for remembering the past, but when you had to watch TV and it was stuff that you didn't want to watch.
Right.
Because your parents were watching it, or there was nothing on and you just had to watch it. And the radio was on, but you didn't want to listen to it, but you had to listen to it and wait. You never do that anymore.
Right.
You only watch what you want to watch. You only listen to what you want to listen to. See what you want to see. And so maybe that is giving rise to it.
Yeah.
It's just all this on demand. What I like immediacy, right? Like you can't. Maybe goes back to the engagement with your life. Maybe at the company or something is so noisy that when you get on the subway, it's like. I just turn it off.
Yeah.
And I just watch, because this is the only time I can have for myself, even if you're, sort of ironically in a crowd of people, everybody's alone, and it's like that sort of old cliche, but maybe that's something to do with it too.
There was a book written by Julian Jaynes in the 1960s. It's called something like The Discovery of the Bicentennial Mind. It's a weird book, but it's close to the title. And in that, he posits when people first started developing an internal monologue they weren't able to, the voice inside their head, they weren't able to recognize it as their own voice, and they thought it was the voice of God. And so when you get God talking to Abraham, go and sacrifice your son, when you get God talking to people, that voice, and he's going, yes, I will do that. It was actually just their own voice.
Right.
But it was it's the development of monkeys essentially becoming conscious and that voice coming, and they weren't able to distinguish between, no, that's actually my voice, or that's actually a voice inside my head. Which is a fascinating thing, that maybe that voice hasn't always been there. Maybe that voice is it's an evolutionary thing, or it's something like that. How many voices do you have inside your head, Tanner?
Right.
It's a serious question, by the way.
I think I like to think it's one. It just talks a lot. I don't know if there's any.
Does it talk nicely?
No. Typically, no. It's keep telling me to keep working, not be so lazy. But yeah, I think it's there, and I think that's maybe a different discussion about the training or something of the space of the psyche to be able to control the noise and to hone it. And maybe that's why we have the art that we do, or the novels that we do, or whatever, that people are taking this voice and very specifically training it to do this particular thing. And maybe that's why it resonates with people, is because, I have that voice, but it's not quite there yet, but I can see where you're getting it from. But that's, who knows?
Traditionally, or at least in Buddhism, the idea was to quieten the monkey mind. That was to stop it chattering all the time, and to just sit and drink from the empty cup and look at the rock grow. Now, you can't drink from an empty cup, and you can't watch a rock grow, but that was the kind of the Buddhist approach to these things, to silence everything by doing those. I'm not sure if that's how I did it, but for the inside of my head is just quiet. There's nothing in it. That's what it sounds like in there.
Just the wind is coming in.
Yeah, I'm just an NPC. I'm just an NPC.
Yeah.
The weird thing is I have far too many thoughts, but there's nothing in there going. What do you think about the rural-urban space? So just while we're on this, like this mass urbanization, Korea was an agricultural society. Gangnam was a field, and all of these things, and the literature you're researching is written during those transformative times when Korea goes from being farm and rice to something completely different. How does that physical space change? What do you find about that?
Yeah, I'm very much interested in the concepts of the centripetal and the centrifugal, about the Seoul became essentially it looks like it now. I think people say Seoul is or Seoul and Gyeonggi-do are like the egg and the yolk, how it's that shape. But it's funny because it looks like that and it performs in the same function. And I'm very interested in the reach of Seoul, not only what it is or like the physicality of it, but the ideology that goes along with urbanization is spreading outwards, along with the law and along with people and all these things. And at the same time, you have the, if I'm remembering correctly, centripetal going inward back into Seoul, because now people live in Gyeonggi-do and Suwon and whatever, and yet they work in Seoul and they have to come back here, and then they go back home, and then they keep, so it's very like back and forth, where instead of just building up other cities outside of Seoul, we just expand Seoul into the rest of South Korea almost. And like between Seoul and Busan, it's just those two things. Maybe Daegu or whatever. But I became interested in the rural and in the urban because, like I said before, this ideological difference, this fervent attitude to push Seoul, or to push South Korea, Freudian slip there, as far as we could go, and what the hell, just leave stuff behind. Like, we need to progress. And if you don't like it, then, well, this is where the Seimaul Undong came in. Here's the tools to do it yourself then. Build your own roads, and we'll kind of supervise it. But you got to do it because people got to get to work, because guess what? Now they work in Seoul. And how are you going to get there? Well, you got to build your freeways. So, and Seoul became such a focus that the rural areas, the Shigor, were like left to die or to join, right? And so in particular in Park Bum-shin's work in Purip처럼, you have this representation. It's not among other things, being gendered. All, if not most, of the characters in the story have dead or dying mothers, who, guess what, live in the countryside. That's not an accident, right? There's the countryside represented this past, this dying nature or something, at least in my opinion. And if you want to survive, you have to go to Seoul. You have to go to the urban areas. And so I became interested in like this very much ideological divide of past and future, or past and present. And if you want to survive, even if it's like on a dirt floor in Seoul, at least you have a job here, rather than whatever you'd be doing, farming or something in the countryside. And like that was the distinction that was being pushed forward by the Park Chung-hee movement and the government, was you have to get on board. Otherwise, you're going to get steamrolled, right? I mean, you're going to get left behind. Which is fascinating because, like I said, this is why I'm so interested, is because at the same time you had, well, we have to protect our Korean people. Well, which one? Who are you talking about? You're talking about the people who suddenly have this idea of like, oh, okay, kundaesong, modernism. Like, I've heard of that, but I don't know what that is. And then people just tell you top down, here's what it is. Build your house in this such a way. Build whatever in this such a way. Because that's what other people are doing. Okay. And now you have to live in a patte, because we have to make room for all these, whatever. So, I think this novel really emphasizes that distinction that was being made, that was being forced on different populations in the same country. So
I wonder if that's why the Tessa and the Tale are also dying out, because you might associate that with going to the hometown, going to the countryside and going and doing that. Yeah. But now everybody's just in Seoul, and the parents are in Seoul. Fewer and fewer people are in the Tibang or in the countryside. The more and more are in Seoul, and Seoul's not associated with those things.
Right.
The countryside is associated with the past.
Yeah. Right. There's even a term called the Republic of Seoul nowadays.
Yeah. And there's in Seoul.
Yeah. Even for universities or like their companies or just living in Seoul, that is a term. And just, I went to Seoul Women's University, right? And some of the friends that went to the like similar ranking of universities, but those are in Gyeonggi-do, they would often say to me like, oh, but you went to Seoul University, that's special, like that makes you different from me, kind of stuff. Even if the ranking itself is similar. I think that there's something romanticizing or like something a promising future thing like people made of about the Seoul, I think. So I highly agree with your insights.
Yeah, I that's just really interesting because it brings up a lot of issues about the ranking thing, which I still am trying to wrap my head around. But the like, what's real? Like, is it access? Because they assume you're going to have access to X, Y, and Z because you go to a university in Seoul, or like, is it somehow you're going to learn something because you're in Seoul that is going to provide you with a better future than me who goes to a university in Gyeonggi-do. You know what I mean? Like, is there a secret that only Seoul people know? And that's what it seems like, right? It's like this, you have this specific key that opens these doors, like, and this master key, and I don't, because I went to a different, I went to Gangwon-dae or something, and I don't have that master key. I have these specific keys that only open these doors. Yeah. And I don't know. Is it a mindset? Is it true? I think it's both. I don't know.
Why Seoul? From where?
Maybe all of the things that you mentioned, and it's as abstract as the Han thing. Yeah, like it's just passed down because, like, in the past, the important companies or like high-ranked things are all in Seoul, and those thoughts are like handed down to their like childs, and we just heard to going in Seoul is a very good thing. We are heard to like growing up, so maybe it's just a handed down thing. We don't really know the meaning of it.
Yeah.
That's what makes it a culture.
Yeah,
I think, because it's
I
a
remember
real thing.
Yeah.
You know, it is passed down. And my nephew got accepted to Korea University. Everyone's like, but it's the Sejong campus. And it was like, oh my God, no. And it's like, how is that even a decision? You should go to the moon. This is fantastic. You get to write on your resume, right? That. And he's like, but it's not in Seoul.
Right.
And wow.
Right.
It really hit home to me how real the power of Seoul is. Everyone's trying to get in there. Anton Schultz wrote in his book 한국인들의 이상한 행복, the strange happiness of the Korean people. He wrote in one of his chapters, people would rather be unhappy in Seoul than happy in the Shigon.
Yeah.
They'd rather sleep on the floor and do that. But what I like, Tanner, is that this was happening in the 70s.
Oh, very much. Yeah.
It's not a modern, that is modern, I guess. The 70s is modern, but it was even happening back then. Yeah,
I think it's an interesting distinction with the generational difference. I think you mentioned that it's just sort of passed down, and you just sort of inherit this type of aptitude or whatever about it. But then at that time, it seemed more forced. At least in the text that I've read, it seemed like do or die, more or less. And maybe to a certain extent it is still a do or die kind of thing. Depends on who you ask, I guess. But I think it's for survival. I think in the very basic sense, it seemed... I'm seeing a lot more similarities now that you mentioned that. Maybe not to such a drastic extent, but I think I still do see the survival instinct to just get a job, because the countryside did not have jobs. I mean, it just wasn't there. Or for different pursuits, who knows? I mean, if you wanted to be an artist, or if you wanted to, it's not just, I got to go there and be a factory worker. It's like people have other aspirations. But I think that it was just opportunity. I mean, you hear about something in the countryside and you want to go there. I mean, it's not unlike people going to New York City to become an actor or a playwright or something. It's like, that's where things happen.
Go to California.
Yeah.
Or something
right.
like that.
And I'm going to be an actor. Well, where do you go to be an actor? New York or L.A.?
Yeah.
Maybe Chicago. Yeah. And that's it. I mean, but I think Korea is a very strong example of that. But the more you mention that, and the more I think about, where you go to school, where your hakbu was, is all very, very important still. And I think it still shows to me that Korea still is a very small society. I think South Korea is very small, especially Seoul. I think it's very, very close knit still. No matter how individualistic people get, I think you have to have those connections. You have to have those whatever. And maybe that's why Sogeting is still around. It's like, I know this person.
Yep.
And I don't want you to go out and just see what you can find. It's like, I know this person. You should meet this girl or this guy or whatever. It's like, it still exists. It's still very much close-knit, right? So these things keep popping up, even in a very hyper-individualizing country.
We drive like an hour and a half, 2 hours to go to this one dentist that's a family friend. I'm like, there's a dentist right next to our house. It's like, no, this is my onni, and this, and it's because that's connections.
Yeah.
Dentists are not cheap. You've got kids, braces, implants, all of this stuff going on. So there's a financial thing, but there's also, no, that's my onni. That's my older sister, not her real sister, but that's a graduate school connection. And over there is that. And our hairdressers, our dentists and things like this, they're not always done through sort of this bureaucratic, identity-free, capitalist way. Still today in society, they're run through our hairdressers connected to us in some way. Our dentist is connected to us in some way through these jobs or military or graduate school, things like that.
Yeah, it's still a very small society, I think, in a lot of ways.
So the really interesting thing is, Yunseo, when you said, but I didn't live during the 1970s, and none of us did, but maybe it's not that different. Because it feels like, no, this is a whole nother world. These people didn't have they had nothing. But then, was it that different? Is it like reading, because I just finished reading Shogun, and that's 16th century Japan, and yes, that is different. There's samurai, and there's a ritual suicide and death and all of this. That's very different. But is 1970s Korea that different from 2024 Korea? I nearly got that wrong.
Yeah, right. I almost corrected you before. You did say 2023. Yeah.
You're like my mom,
I don't know if you heard that too.
I got it right.
I think it's interesting, and I think the more we talk about it, the more I'm seeing similarities, which is great because this is all fueling. But anyway, I think that's one of the main goals or research concepts that you have to think about as you're writing or as you research or whatever is the relevance of your research to today. Because if I just wrote in such a way that it was just mattered at that time, it's not important because we don't live in the 1970s South Korea. But I think it's still there, and I think the origins of something are there. I mentioned national literature before, that it was such a big topic. Like, we need to decide what this means, and I don't think they did. I mean, how can you? But I think it's very much alive. And so all these aspects are still very much 50 years, 60 years later, are still around. We still have problems of the noisiness of Seoul. How do we deal with the countryside in a way that's not pandering to them, but also in a way that's not leaving them behind. It's not steamrolling them because of, for the sake of modernity, whatever that means. And so I'm trying, this is one thing that I've constantly have to consider is how can I bring this up to today? Why does this matter? You need to point out, see how this is developed? Yeah, this was very similar, or this started in this particular time, and now we're seeing the results of it, or the effects of it, or whatever. I think it's still there. I think it's and I hope that the literature today in South Korea, but also in other places, I hope it's resonating with people, with South Koreans, not just for a Sunung thing, but that's not a specifically South Korean problem. That's everywhere. Yeah. You're kind of, these are the books that are on the curriculum. This is what you read. And, maybe when you're in graduate school, you can realize, oh, this is actually important. So I don't know.
I think it also depends on the teachers.
Yeah.
I had to read Hamlet and things like that. I loved it. I had to read To Kill a Mockingbird, loved it. Maybe I just like reading, but also the teachers and Korean people now, to their credit, are incredibly literate. Incredibly literate Korean people.
They have one of the most literate societies in the world.
Read and write to very high standards. Yeah. And if you compare it to other parts of the world, or even if you compare it to Korea, I heard that when they go and vote and they use those little red stamps and they'll put it on their... They did that because when they were first voting, they couldn't read or write. And so people would just go and stamp the second one. And so that was a demonstration that people couldn't actually... The literary rates were so low. And what they've achieved in terms of that, maybe it hasn't made these souls, like you're saying, these soulless people, but maybe that's the next step, to read and write. And I wonder what it's like to write novels in a non-democratic society. Like, I write a column every week, and I never worry about well, can I say this?
Mm-hmm.
Can I swear if I want?
Right.
Let's throw a swear word in there this week. And I don't like to swear and be abrasive, but no, I want to say that. And I want to say this. And, I try not to self-censor. I try to be real. But imagine writing in a non-democracy.
Right.
Imagine writing where Park Chung-hee sat in his office and he could say, Namsan kara.
Yeah.
And get to Namsan or something. That must be weird.
Yeah. It's, and when you read more about the censoring and the censorship practices of specifically Yushin Shide, it was so arbitrary. It was so random. There was no structure to it. It was just this guy happened to read this particular short story on this Tuesday and didn't like this sentence and therefore whatever, shut the whole publishing place down. Whatever. It was just so random, so arbitrary. That it just shows the ridiculousness of it all, of the whole practice, that just for the sake of, I don't like this.
Is there anything that the writers are saying but not saying? Do you see what I mean? If you were writing and you know that someone's watching you, you know that the president's watching you. Like, I can't say that, but I want to say that. I want to say the president sucks, but I can't say that.
Yeah.
Is there a, I'm not sure what you call this, a secondary text or something going on, or are there unwritten things? Because the books that you've chosen, very good ones, very critical ones, but they're the ones that survived.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean by this? I wonder what didn't survive, or what they wanted to say, or if you took away all the constraints from them, if you gave them democracy,
yeah,
and you ask them, what do you really want to say? I wonder what would come out then.
Yeah. The only thing I can think of is, maybe you read this also for Kim Ji-ha, The Five Bandits.
I know that one.
Yeah, that's the only.
It's the long poem, isn't
it?
Yeah.
And sort of a reference to the Japanese colonial period, whatever. Sorry, that's the only thing I can think of. But guess what? He got in trouble for that, and he was, I think he had, I don't know if he was sentenced to death for that one, or if he he was tortured. Sorry, as if that's better. But yeah. So I mean, it was there. I don't know what went unpublished or what, because chances are those texts are just gone, burned and whatever. But yeah, that's the only one I can think of right now that caused such a stir, that we have to go and torture this writer because although he never mentioned my name, I don't like this. And it's almost like a medieval king kind of thing, where I go out and I find this specific guy,
right?
And it's very scary, I think, to think that was a possibility.
Yeah.
Just for writing something. Didn't go out and harm anybody, didn't call for an uprising, didn't whatever. It was just like, I don't really like how things are going in my city or my country right now, and you get tortured for it. And, so very, very, it's surprising but also unsurprising how far humans can go against each other because of power and because of things like that. So yeah.
And how, if you grow up not able to speak your own language, you grow up not being able to express your own thoughts. I'm talking about Japanese colonization and then dictatorship. And then you say, Korean people don't speak up enough in class.
Right.
You're like, well, what have they been doing for the last 100 years? They've been, they could die if they did that. To express their inner thoughts is a very interesting thing. Kim Ji-ha was his pen name, meaning basement, which is a nice one. Do you feel, Yunseo, in modern society, do you feel any I shouldn't say that? Do you work, because these people were writing when they could have been in trouble from Park Chung-hee and things like that. Do you feel like any pressure today in society about what you type or what you say?
To be honest, today it was meant to talk about Park Chung-hee as well, right? So I felt a little cautious today, before coming here, because I wanted to be a journalist in the future. Then my intrusive thoughts said that, what if this become a problem or something?
Right.
Nobody's listening.
It's left over. It's still very potent in that in that regards. Like that, the fact that you even might be just at a minuscule level concerned about anything about your future, what you might say about a president who's been dead for almost 50 years. But maybe that's my privilege to say that as an American, you know, and these are the sort of issues that come up often in these conversations of international communication. I was raised not to say certain things because of this might happen, but for me, I'm like, I can say whatever, you know, and like, I have to be conscious of that, you know.
Even in the latest movies, Hole Bom, the one about Chun Doo-won's coup d'etat, they didn't call him Chun Doo-won.
Yeah, it was Chun Doo-kwan or something.
Yeah.
And I'm like, come on.
We all know.
Everybody knows it. I can't remember what
like
No Teu was or something like that.
Yeah.
Right? But the fact that they didn't do that really took me and sort of said, yeah, this country is still very sensitive to certain things. Yeah. And I don't know. I'm caught between two things because like you, Tanner, I think, no, it's very important to try to speak the truth because you don't really know what you think sometimes. Like, what do I really like? Really? And you have to get it out and find out and make mistakes and be wrong. But the idea of always self-censoring and not saying things, I mean, I think we're very lucky to live in the societies we do, that we should try to exercise that because then we can communicate with people. At the same time, you need to be sensitive and you want to try to, you know, be careful of your positions and things like that. Yeah. So you're really worried that, oh, wow, if I say something about this, that in future they might dig this up in 20 years.
A little bit worried, yeah.
Interesting.
The internet is forever.
Yeah. It's just haunting. Yeah.
Well, I'll ask you when we stop the record.
There's no record of it.
Just as we bring this to a close, because it's been lovely. Any book recommendations? Any reading records? Because we've talked a bit about books and everything else today, but any of you, like, what are you reading? What do you want to read? Reading for 2024 for other people?
I definitely recommend, I can't remember the Korean title, unfortunately, but Cursed Bunny is if you've heard of it, it was a finalist at least in English, as a National Book Award winner in the U.S. From the translation from Anton He. But that one is by Bora Kim. Bora, I think.
It's definitely a
Kim
Bora. I had Bora, but I didn't have the family name.
Oh my God,
I
I'm
think
so
it's
sorry
Bora
if I'm
butchering.
if I'm forgetting the surname. But yeah, definitely recommend that. It's have you heard of it?
Just heard of it. Yeah.
Very. Like bordering on the magical realism, scientific, weird things are happening, but it's just accepted as normal. Very, very good book. The translation is excellent. That's, I think, why he's up for an award for it.
He does good work these days, doesn't he, Anton He?
Yes.
He's really busy.
Super busy. Yeah.
Good on him.
Unfortunately, a lot of texts from the 70s aren't translated, except for mainly thanks to the efforts of Bruce and Chuchan Fulton, who have translated so many texts, mostly short stories from the 70s. There's a lot of, modern Korean literature, like anthologies and things like that. But novels are rare, I think, in translation, especially from that time.
It'd be rude if I didn't say Brother Anthony's name.
Yeah, right. But
he does so much.
He does so much too. But I also, Hangang, her Human X text is very good. I recommend that, about the Gwangju uprising.
There's a scene or a chapter in that where, like, it's a conversation with the soul leaving the body. And it's like, wow.
Yeah, it's a very, very, very good
Have
text.
you heard Hangang talk?
No.
She kind of talks like this. 광주에서 사람들이 그렇게 하고, and it's because I'm sorry, I don't mean to cause offense, but she has a very kind of powerful way of writing, and it's very it's loud to me. But then I heard her voice, I was like, wow. It's the kind of voice that would sing you a lullaby going to sleep or something. It really affected me in a way.
Interesting. No, I never heard her speak, actually.
There's got bits where she reads her work online and things like this. So Cursed Bunny, Human X,
The Dwarf, obviously. Maybe you can reread it and get something new out of it.
Sounds like a teacher again. He's back to high one.
Otherwise, I mean, there's a lot of short stories that I mean, too many to name, that are just in modern Korean anthologies. Otherwise, anything that you can get your hands on, that's translated into English from Lee Kwang-soo, I mean, he's a controversial figure in himself, because of his Chinilpa, like kind of Japanese-ish leaning. But anyway, besides that, the texts themselves are so good and so, I think, beyond their time. In terms of dealing, like, he has a story called Maybe Love, that deals with a potential gay meeting or feelings between two men, and it's never really explicitly said, for obvious reasons. But like even 100 years ago, so this shows, I think, that the study of Korean literature has this potential that's not just enmeshed in like modernized K-pop-ish like Gangnam Korea.
Yeah.
There's a very strong tradition to Korean literature that's been there, and Lee Kwang-soo is very much the reason why that is. And I think to start with him would be a good idea, for anybody who might be interested in Korean literature. But yeah, otherwise,
because it's fascinating, because there's a weird idea that if you want to understand Korea, you have to read the history books, but sometimes you can get more truth from the fiction. There's that kind of paradox. Yunseo, any books or any ideas, any thoughts about reading? You don't have to say yes. You don't have to do any like
personally, I thought that I should read The Dwarf again, definitely, and I think that I should try 소설가 구보 씨의 일일, because I never thought that the mental and thinking thing could be a place. So I thought that with that approach, that would be very interesting to read that novel.
Maybe leave dictate for another 10 years or something.
It's almost like maybe read it and then read it again in 10 years and see what happens.
Yeah.
That was like how I felt with Catcher in the Rye. Like I felt like I have to read this every turning point of my life to get something new out of it.
We once walked down the road. It was one of my best friend's favorite books, and we were coming back from a festival one summer. Obviously, a little bit worse for wear. We'd been away for 2-3 days. We were walking back, and we found in the middle of the road a brand new copy of Catcher in the Rye. It was just there. It was just there in the middle of the road.
Here?
Back in the UK.
Oh, okay.
But it was just there.
Interesting.
We picked up, and he's like, I've got a couple of copies of this already. It's my favourite book, but there it was. And we didn't quite believe it. And I had to text him the next day. It was like, yeah, it's still there. it's still there. Yeah.
Isn't that a great metaphor?
Finding books.
It's always there.
It's nice to hand on books to other people. It's nice to pass on books to other people. It's nice to let other people read. I would just close up maybe by saying that the first book I read this year was Albert Camus' collection of essays, The Myth of Sisyphus. And while I like the first one, at the back of that book, there's these 4 or 5 short essays that he wrote, and they're kind of like travel bits of writing. And anyone that's read my columns recently, if you read those, you'll see, they're picking up similar ways of approaching subjects. There was this line at the start of one of them, and the line, I'll get it as best I can, was something like this. It had been raining for 5 days consistently. It had been raining for 5 days consistently, and by the end of the 5th day, even the sea was wet. I told that to my wife, and she looked at me, and I said, "Isn't that amazing?" She went, "That's nonsense. How can the sea be?" And I just, all right, stop. We're not having that conversation. But I loved it, that even the sea got wet after 5 days. That was something that really moved me. Albert Camus, kind of like a travel writing. Beautiful writer, all philosophy aside, but that was something. Any final words or anything to shout out, Tanner?
I just hope that people enjoy reading. That's ultimately my goal. I hope to become a teacher or professor, and these types of conversations I think are so important and so special, in any context, whether it's a classroom or in a bar or whatever. So I think I don't know, it sounds really cliche, but I think if we keep reading, I think there's always something to do. There's always something to talk about.
Yeah.
So we need people to write too. And then people to cover the news stories maybe about this new fiction that's like blowing everybody's minds. But yeah, I hope that this type of literature can, there's a reason that it's still around. There's a reason that people like me are still reading it and talking about it. So maybe, yeah, I hope that it'll keep being that way. Yeah. And thank you for having me today.
Thank you for being here. Lovely. And relax.
Okay.
Wow.
That's it.
Okay, so anyway, Park Chung-hee.
There's still hot
Thank
mics.
you so much.
Yeah.
Yunseo, that was your first 3-hour one.
Oh, wow.
That's pretty good. Didn't even get something, not even a 15-minute break. That was great.
I wasn't sure how long you wanted.